When a worn-out single dad in economy class becomes the only thing standing between 280 passengers and certain death, everyone who judged him by his hoodie and stubble will learn that heroes don't always look the part. Caleb Mercer buried his combat pilot past to raise his daughter alone. But tonight, at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic with both pilots down and hydraulics failing, that past is about to save everyone who ever doubted him. Before we begin this incredible journey, I invite you to stay with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoy it, please hit that like button and comment with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. Now, let's dive in. The fluorescent lights of O'Hare's Terminal 3 cast everything in that particular shade of exhausted blue that only exists in airports after midnight. Caleb Mercer stood in the economy boarding line with his daughter Maisie pressed against his hip, her small hand clutching the strap of his backpack while her other arm held tight to Mr. Buttons, the threadbare teddy bear that had once belonged to her mother. "Daddy, I'm sleepy," Maisie whispered, her 7-year-old voice barely audible over the gate announcements and rolling suitcases. "I know, baby. Just a little longer, then you can sleep on the plane." Caleb adjusted the single backpack on his shoulder, everything they owned for this trip compressed into one bag because checked luggage cost extra, and extra wasn't something they had. His hoodie was faded gray, comfortable in the way that expensive things never quite manage. His jeans had a small patch on one knee that Maisie had insisted on decorating with fabric markers, turning the repair into a garden of crooked flowers. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. Not because he was making a statement, but because razors and shaving cream were luxuries that fell off the list when you were choosing between them and your daughter's art supplies. The line shuffled forward. Around them, business travelers in pressed suits tapped impatiently at their phones. A woman in designer athleisure wear wrinkled her nose slightly as she stepped around Caleb to join her companion in first class. He was used to it, the quick assessments, the subtle distances people created. A single dad in economy didn't register as anyone important, and that was fine. He'd stopped caring about how he registered years ago. "Excuse me, young man?" Caleb turned to find an elderly woman struggling with an oversized carry-on, her thin arms shaking with the effort of lifting it. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, and the bag was almost as big as she was. "Let me help you with that, ma'am." Caleb lifted the suitcase with ease, feeling the familiar pull in his shoulders, the kind of strength that came from years of physical training that he still maintained, though most people wouldn't guess it beneath the tired dad exterior. "Oh, thank you so much. These arms aren't what they used to be." She smiled at him, the kind of genuine warmth that reminded him of his own grandmother. "Traveling alone?" "With my daughter." He gestured to Maisie, who had discovered a fascinating pattern in the carpet and was tracing it with the toe of her sneaker. "What a sweetheart. Where are you headed?" "London. A friend from my old days is getting married. Figured it was time Maisie saw something beyond Chicago." "How wonderful. Your wife must be excited." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Caleb saw Maisie's shoulders tense slightly. "It's just us," he said simply, keeping his voice even. "But yeah, we're excited." The woman's expression shifted to something softer, more knowing. She touched his arm briefly. "You're a good father, I can tell." Boarding started with first class, of course. Caleb watched them file through, the polished shoes, the leather bags, the confident stride of people who knew the world was built to accommodate them. He'd been one of them once, in a different uniform, a different life. Now he waited his turn with Maisie tucked against his side, counting the minutes until they could sit down and she could rest. When their group was finally called, Caleb guided Maisie down the jetway, her small hand in his larger one. The aircraft was a Boeing 707, massive and sleek, the kind of engineering marvel he'd once understood intimately from a very different perspective. Now he was just another passenger in seat 8B, middle row, economy section. He helped Maisie into the window seat, buckled her in, and tucked Mr. Buttons into the crook of her arm. She was already yawning, her eyes heavy with the kind of exhaustion that only children can fight against with such determination. "Can I have the gummy bears now?" she asked, remembering the small package he'd bought at the airport convenience store. "After takeoff, sweetie. We talked about this. But I'm hungry now." "I know, just a little longer." Around them, the cabin filled with the usual chaos of boarding, overhead bins slamming, passengers negotiating space, flight attendants offering that professional smile that said they'd already been on their feet for 12 hours, and this was just the beginning of another long night. In first class, separated from economy by a curtain that might as well have been a wall, Vanessa Caldwell settled into her seat with the practiced efficiency of someone who flew twice a week. She was 38, a senior partner at a corporate law firm in Manhattan, and she'd built her career on reading people quickly and accurately. The Hermes bag tucked into the overhead compartment had been a gift to herself after winning a particularly brutal merger case. The tailored blazer she wore even on a red-eye flight was armor, a signal that she was never off duty, never less than impeccable. She'd noticed the man in the hoodie at the gate. You couldn't help but notice when someone looked so profoundly out of place. Single father, clearly struggling, probably couldn't even afford decent luggage. She'd assessed and dismissed him in the same glance, the way she assessed and dismissed anything that wasn't relevant to her immediate concerns. Right now, those concerns were the contract brief she needed to review before landing and the breakfast meeting she had scheduled for 8 a.m. London time. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Maisie watched with drowsy attention while Caleb stared at nothing in particular, his mind already elsewhere. He was thinking about Sarah. He always thought about Sarah when they flew, because she'd loved flying, loved the moment when the wheels left the ground, and you were suddenly suspended between earth and sky. She'd died when Maisie was 3, a stupid accident that still didn't make sense 4 years later. A drunk driver running a red light. 3 seconds of someone else's terrible decision, and suddenly he was a single father with a toddler who kept asking when mommy was coming home. He'd quit everything to take care of her. The career he'd built, the life he'd planned, the identity he'd worn like a second skin, all of it went into a box labeled before so he could focus entirely on after. And after meant being present, being steady, being the one thing Maisie could count on when everything else had been torn away. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. The engine spooled up with that distinctive whine that most passengers barely noticed, but that made something deep in Caleb's chest tighten with sense memory. He'd spent 12 years of his life living and breathing jet engines, understanding their moods and capabilities the way some people understood music. But that was over. That was before. Takeoff was smooth. Maisie lasted about 15 minutes before sleep claimed her completely, her head dropping onto Caleb's shoulder, Mr. Buttons squashed between them. Caleb shifted carefully to make her more comfortable, then pulled out the paperback mystery novel he'd been working through in stolen moments over the past month. It wasn't great literature, but it kept his mind occupied during the hours after Maisie went to bed, when the apartment was too quiet and the memories too loud. The seatbelt sign dinked off. The cabin settled into the particular hush of a red-eye flight, passengers cocooning themselves in blankets and neck pillows, trying to convince their bodies that sleep was possible in an upright position at 35,000 feet. Caleb had just found his place in the book when the aircraft jolted. Not the gentle bump of routine turbulence, but a violent sideways lurch that sent his paperback flying and his stomach into his throat. Around the cabin, passengers gasped and grabbed for armrests. Overhead bins rattled. Someone's phone clattered into the aisle. Maisie jerked awake with a frightened squeak. "Daddy?" "It's okay, baby. Just some bumps." He pulled her close, feeling her heart hammering against his side. But his own heart was beating faster, too, and not just from the turbulence. That jolt had felt wrong. Not weather, but mechanical. The way the aircraft had yawed suggested something with the control surfaces, or possibly hydraulics. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. We've encountered some unexpected turbulence and are working to find smoother air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately." The professional calm in the captain's voice was good, but Caleb heard the edge beneath it, the slight compression that came from speaking while managing a problem. He'd used that exact tone himself years ago, when things were going sideways and the last thing you wanted was panic spreading through the aircraft. The flight attendants moved quickly to their jump seats, and that was the second sign that something was genuinely wrong. On a routine flight, they'd finished their service before strapping in. Cutting it short meant the flight deck was telling them to prioritize safety over passenger comfort. Another jolt, harder this time. The aircraft dropped what felt like 100 feet in a heartbeat, that stomach-in-your-throat sensation of free fall that made half the cabin cry out. Maisie buried her face against Caleb's chest, and he wrapped both arms around her, holding her steady while his mind raced through possibilities. System failure. Had to be. The way they were moving through the air felt increasingly sluggish, like the controls were responding but with delay. Hydraulics. Definitely hydraulics. The 777 had 3 independent systems, so losing one shouldn't cause this much trouble unless… Daddy, I'm scared. I know, sweetie. I've got you. We're going to be fine. He believed it when he said it, because he had to believe it. But another part of his mind, the part that had been trained to assess and respond to aerial emergencies, was running calculations he didn't want to complete. In first class, Vanessa had abandoned any pretense of working. Her laptop was secured, her briefcase stowed, both hands gripping the armrests. She'd flown hundreds of times, weathered plenty of turbulence, but this felt different. The woman next to her was praying quietly in Spanish. Across the aisle, a businessman had gone gray, his eyes fixed on the emergency card he'd pulled from the seat pocket. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Chen. Captain Morrison has been injured and is unable to continue. I need anyone with military or commercial flight experience to identify themselves to a flight attendant immediately. I repeat, we need someone with pilot experience. The cabin went completely silent for 3 heartbeats. Then chaos erupted, passengers talking over each other, fear spreading like spilled water. A woman started crying. Someone shouted a question nobody could answer. The flight attendants were already moving through the aisles, searching faces, looking for anyone who might be their lifeline. Caleb sat very still, Maisie clutching his hoodie with both fists. His mouth had gone dry. 12 years he'd been out of the cockpit. 12 years since he'd touched military controls, run emergency procedures, made split-second decisions at altitude. He'd walked away from all of it deliberately, completely, because that life had no room for being the kind of father Maisie needed. But right now, on this aircraft, with whatever was happening to the control systems and a first officer who sounded young and terrified and very alone up front, Daddy! Maisie was looking up at him with those enormous brown eyes that were exactly like Sarah's. What's happening? The pilot needs help, baby. Can someone help them? Caleb looked down at his daughter, at the trust in her face, the absolute certainty that adults would fix this because adults always fix things. Then he looked around the cabin, at the elderly woman he'd helped with her bag, now white-knuckled and shaking, at the young couple 2 rows up holding hands like they might never let go, at the teenager across the aisle who was texting frantically, probably trying to say goodbye to someone. 280 people, 280 lives. He could stay seated. Let someone else step forward. He'd earned the right to just be a passenger, just be a dad, just be nobody important in a faded hoodie who'd left that other life behind. But Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, something she'd said to him years ago when he was struggling with whether to extend his service or get out. You're not the kind of person who can watch someone drown and not jump in. It's not in your wiring. Maisie. He took her face gently in his hands. I need you to be very brave right now. Can you do that for me? Her lip trembled, but she nodded. I'm going to go help the pilot. I'm going to walk up to the front of the plane and help them land us safely. But I need you to stay here in your seat with Mr. Buttons and be brave. Can you do that? You know how to fly planes? I used to, a long time ago. Will you come back? The question broke something in his chest. Always, baby. I will always come back to you, I promise. He kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, committing this moment to memory just in case. No, he couldn't think like that. He was coming back. They were all coming back, all going to walk off this aircraft and into their lives on the other side of this night. Caleb unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. The cabin was still in controlled chaos, flight attendants trying to manage the panic, passengers demanding answers nobody had. He made his way into the aisle, moving forward against the current of fear. A flight attendant grabbed his arm, young woman, 20-something, trying hard to maintain composure. Sir, you need to return to your seat. I'm a pilot. I can help. She looked at him, really looked, and he saw the assessment happen in real time. The hoodie, the stubble, the exhausted dad energy, the doubt flickered across her face before she could hide it. Ma'am, I flew F-18s for 12 years. I know this aircraft. I can help. Something in his voice, or maybe in his eyes, convinced her. She nodded and spoke into her handset, rapid-fire communication with the flight deck. Then she gestured forward. "Come with me." Caleb moved through economy into the business class section, very aware that every eye in the cabin was on him. He could feel their fear, their desperate hope, and also their doubt. He didn't look like a hero. He didn't look like someone who could save them. He was halfway through business class when a figure stepped into the aisle ahead of him, blocking his path. Vanessa Caldwell had watched this man board, dismissed him as irrelevant, and now she was watching him walk toward the cockpit claiming to be a pilot. And every instinct she'd honed over 15 years of litigation was screaming that something was wrong with this picture. "Hold on." Her voice carried the particular authority of someone used to being obeyed. "You're saying you're a pilot?" Caleb stopped, making himself breathe steady, keep his voice calm. "Yes, ma'am. Former military. I can help." "Former? How long ago?" 12 years. Her eyebrows went up. 12 years out of the cockpit, and you think you can handle a commercial aircraft emergency? Around them, passengers were listening, the doubt spreading. Caleb could feel the moment teetering. He needed to get forward, needed to assess the situation. But this woman had just planted a seed of uncertainty that was taking root fast. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but every second we waste is a second we can't afford. The first officer needs help now." Or maybe he needs actual help, not someone who hasn't flown in over a decade and certainly never flew anything like this. Vanessa's voice was sharp with stress and fear disguised as logic. "How do we know you're even who you say you are? You could be anyone. You could make this worse." A man 2 rows back spoke up. "She's got a point. How do we know he's qualified?" "Maybe we should wait for someone else." "There is no one else." The flight attendant's voice cut through the rising panic. "Sir, we need to move. Now." But the damage was done. Caleb could see it in the faces around him. The hesitation, the suspicion. He was asking them to trust their lives to someone who looked like he could barely afford his plane ticket, who hadn't flown in 12 years, who might be lying or delusional or making everything worse. "I know how this looks," Caleb said. And he wasn't talking to Vanessa anymore, but to everyone. To the whole cabin of frightened people who needed to believe in something. "I know I don't look like your idea of a pilot, but I swear to you, on my daughter's life, she's sitting in 8B and she's the most important thing in my world. I swear I can help. I need you to let me try." Another violent jolt shook the aircraft, and the decision made itself. The flight attendant grabbed Caleb's arm and pulled him forward, past Vanessa's protests, through first class where faces turned to track his progress with expressions caught between hope and horror. They reached the cockpit door. The flight attendant knocked in a pattern, security protocol, and it opened from inside. The scene was worse than Caleb had imagined. Captain Morrison was slumped in his seat, blood streaming from a head wound where he'd apparently struck the instrument panel during the initial event. First Officer Chen, and he really was young, couldn't be more than 28, was fighting the controls with both hands, sweat pouring down his face, his breathing ragged with panic and effort. Standing behind the center console was a man in his 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a polo shirt with a small pin on the collar. Retired Navy, Caleb would bet his life on it. This man turned as Caleb entered, and his expression went from desperate hope to skepticism in a heartbeat. "This is who you brought me?" He didn't bother hiding his dismay. "Where's your uniform, your credentials?" "Don't have them." Caleb was already scanning the instrument panels, his training kicking in despite 12 years of rust. Hydraulic pressure. All 3 systems showing degraded performance, but not failed. Altitude holding, but with oscillations that suggested control issues. Airspeed stable. They weren't in immediate danger of falling from the sky, but they were degrading, and degrading fast. "I'm former military, F-18 Super Hornets, 12 years carrier operations." 12 years ago, you mean? The retired Navy man, his polo pin said Commander Reynolds, moved to block Caleb's view of the instruments. "Son, I appreciate the intent, but this isn't an F-18. This is a wide-body commercial aircraft with 280 souls on board and failing hydraulics. We need someone current, someone qualified. With respect, sir, you need someone who can fly, and right now I'm what you've got." Caleb kept his voice level, professional, but inside he was screaming at the waste of time. Chen was barely holding it together. Morrison was unconscious and possibly concussed, and this aircraft was hemorrhaging control authority with every passing minute. Reynolds studied him with the particular intensity of someone who'd spent a lifetime making life-or-death assessments of personnel. "What's your name?" "Caleb Mercer, former Lieutenant Commander, VFA 233, Black Lion Squadron." But something flickered in Reynolds' expression. Recognition. Maybe respect. The Black Lions were legendary, and Reynolds would know that. "All right, Mercer, pop quiz, no time to think, just answer. Primary hydraulic failure in a 777, what's your immediate concern?" "Control degradation and backup system capacity. Fly-by-wire has mechanical reversion, but it's limited." "Maximum crosswind component for landing this aircraft?" 38 knots, but functionally less if you've lost hydraulic authority." "Fuel dump procedure. Flip up guards on overhead panel, 2 switches, jettison from both main wing tanks simultaneously to maintain balance, can't dump center tank, minimum safe altitude 3,000 feet AGL." Reynolds' questions came faster, a rapid-fire interrogation that would have broken anyone who didn't know their systems cold. Approach speeds, engine-out procedures, electrical bus configuration, emergency descent profiles. Caleb answered each one without hesitation, pulling information from a part of his brain he'd thought he'd shut down for good. Finally, Reynolds stepped back, his expression grim but decided. "All right, you know your stuff, but knowing and doing are different things. Chen, how are we holding up?" "Not good, Commander." The first officer's voice was tight with strain. "Controls are getting heavier. Whatever we lost initially is cascading. I'm having trouble maintaining altitude, and turns are—" He grunted with effort as the aircraft yawed slightly. "Not responding like they should." Caleb moved to look over Chen's shoulder at the primary flight display. What he saw made his stomach drop. "You've lost most of your primary hydraulics and you're operating on backup, but the backup is degrading too. Did you try the auxiliary pump?" "The what?" Chen shot him a desperate look. Caleb reached past him to the center console, flipping a guard cover and activating a switch that most commercial pilots would never touch in their entire careers because it was buried in the emergency procedures they prayed they'd never need. The auxiliary hydraulic pump, a secondary backup system that could provide just enough pressure to keep the controls responsive, at least for a while. The change was immediate. The control yoke responded to Chen's input with less resistance, and the aircraft's attitude stabilized slightly. "How did you—" Chen started. "Different bird, same principles. Basic hydraulics don't change." Caleb was running system checks in his head, comparing what he was seeing to what he knew from fixed-wing carrier operations. Different aircraft, yes, but the fundamentals were universal. "Commander, how bad is Morrison?" Reynolds was checking the captain's pulse, his expression dark. "Unconscious, possible concussion, definitely not flying tonight. We need to get him out of that seat." Together, they carefully moved Morrison to the small crew rest area behind the cockpit. The captain was breathing steadily, but he'd need medical attention as soon as they landed. If they landed. Caleb took Morrison's seat without asking permission, his hands automatically finding the controls, his mind immediately integrating the feel of the aircraft, the weight, the response, the particular personality of this machine. It was different from the F-18, yes, but also fundamentally similar in the ways that mattered. Both were aircraft. Both responded to lift and drag and thrust and gravity. Both would kill you if you stopped respecting what they could do. "What do we have for landing options?" Caleb asked, scanning the navigation display. Chen pulled up the flight plan. "We were 5 hours from Heathrow. Based on current position and fuel, we could continue, or we could divert to Shannon, or we can't make either one." Caleb had already done the math in his head. "Not with degrading hydraulics. The longer we fly, the worse this gets. We need to land as soon as possible, which means—" He zoomed out the navigation display, looking for options, and his heart sank further. They were over the North Atlantic, that long stretch of empty ocean between continents, where emergency landing options were measured in the dozens of miles between you and cold water. Reynolds leaned over his shoulder, following Caleb's thought process. "There's a divert airport, São Miguel Island in the Azores, Portuguese territory about 40 minutes southeast of our current position. Runway length." Short. Very short. 7,800 feet. Chen made a choked sound. That's too short. We need at least 9,000 feet for a safe landing, and that's under ideal conditions. With compromised hydraulics, we need to land somewhere flat, and preferably not in the ocean. Caleb was already adjusting their heading, turning the massive aircraft toward the coordinates Reynolds provided. ATC, this is United TWI 847 declaring emergency. We have major hydraulic failure, one pilot incapacitated, and we're diverting to São Miguel. The response was immediate. Air traffic control's professional calm masking what had to be barely controlled alarm. They cleared all traffic from their path, began coordinating emergency services on the island, walked through their available options with brutal efficiency. None of the options were good. Mercer. Reynolds' voice was quiet, meant only for him. I've seen the specs on São Miguel. That runway is at sea level, 1 mile from the ocean, with crosswinds that average 15 knots this time of night. Even if we reach it, even if our hydraulics hold that long, landing a 777 on that runway with compromised controls and no ILS. I know. Caleb's hands were steady on the controls, but inside he was a mass of calculation and controlled fear. But it's what we've got. You've never landed a commercial aircraft. No. You've been out of any cockpit for 12 years. Yes. This is insane. Probably. Caleb looked at the navigation display, at the tiny island appearing on the screen, their target, their hope, their slim chance at survival. But Commander, I watched my daughter's face when I told her I was coming back to her. I am not dying in this aircraft, and neither is she. And neither are 278 other people who trusted that this flight would deliver them safely to London. So yes, it's insane, but it's also the only play we have. Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. Then he clapped Caleb on the shoulder, once, hard. All right, then let's run the checklist and figure out how to pull off the impossible. Behind them, Chen had regained some of his composure, buoyed by having someone in command who seemed to know what they were doing, even if that someone was wearing a hoodie and looked like he'd never seen the inside of a cockpit. What do you need from me? Everything. Caleb was pulling up the emergency landing checklist, running through procedures he'd memorized in a different context, but that still applied here. We're going to single-engine landing configuration to reduce our approach speed. Commander, I need you monitoring all systems. Anything changes, anything fails, I need to know immediately. Chen, you're my co-pilot. Call out altitudes, speeds, heading corrections. This is going to be tight, and I need every piece of information you can give me. They worked in tense coordination. 3 men who'd been strangers minutes ago, now bound together by crisis and necessity. Caleb felt the old training sliding back into place. The compartmentalization that let you function when your body wanted to scream. The ability to see the problem as a series of solvable steps, rather than an overwhelming whole. But beneath that professional calm was the image of Maisie's face, the weight of her question. Will you come back? He'd promised her. Always. Now he just had to make good on that promise while flying a crippled aircraft toward a postage stamp runway in the dark, over an ocean that would kill them all in seconds if he miscalculated by even a few degrees. The auxiliary hydraulic pump he'd activated earlier had bought them time, but it wasn't going to last. Caleb could feel the controls getting heavier, the response becoming more sluggish. They were running out of options and running out of time. Mercer. Reynolds' voice was tight. Primary hydraulic pressure just dropped another 10%. We're losing what little authority we had left. Time to São Miguel? 32 minutes at current speed. 32 minutes. 32 minutes to cover the distance, run the approach, and somehow land this massive aircraft on a runway that was barely adequate under perfect conditions, which these decidedly were not. Caleb made a decision. We're going to start our descent now. I want every bit of altitude I can trade for control. Chen, begin shutdown procedures for Engine 2. We're going single engine for the approach. That's... Chen started, then stopped himself. Yes, sir. The protocol said you never shut down a functioning engine unless absolutely necessary. But protocols were written for normal circumstances, and nothing about this was normal. A single-engine approach would cut their speed, reduce their control issues, and give them a fighting chance at making that short runway. It would also mean that if anything went wrong, they'd have zero margin for error. No power to arrest a sink rate, no thrust to climb out of a bad approach. One chance, one attempt, one opportunity to get it right. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Chen. His voice went out over the cabin PA, steadier now with purpose. We're experiencing a hydraulic issue that requires us to land at an alternate airport. We'll be on the ground in approximately 30 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and follow all crew instructions. In the cabin, that announcement landed like a bomb. 30 minutes until landing, normally a routine event, now freighted with all the terror of everything left unsaid. The passengers could feel the aircraft's unusual handling, could sense the tension radiating from the crew. They knew something was desperately wrong, even if no one was saying it explicitly. In seat 8B, Maisie sat alone, hugging Mr. Buttons so tightly that the teddy bear's stuffing was probably compressing. The elderly woman across the aisle leaned over. "Sweetheart, where's your father?" "He went to help fly the plane." Maisie's voice was very small. "He promised he'd come back." "I'm sure he will, dear." But the woman's eyes said something different, said she knew the odds, knew how often promises got broken when aircraft fell from the sky. In the cockpit, Caleb flew. It wasn't like the movies, wasn't dramatic or heroic looking. It was intense concentration and constant micro-adjustments, reading the aircraft's behavior through his hands on the controls, feeling the degradation of systems through the resistance in the yoke. Every control input was a negotiation with an aircraft that was increasingly reluctant to respond. He thought about Sarah. She would have been furious with him for getting back in a cockpit, for putting himself at risk when Maisie needed him. But she would also have understood, because she'd always understood that some things you couldn't turn away from, some responsibilities you couldn't shirk just because they were terrifying. 20 miles out, Chen's voice. São Miguel Tower has us on radar and has cleared emergency services to the runway. Weather? Crosswind at 12 knots, gusting to 17. Visibility good. Ceiling unlimited. Small mercies. At least they could see the runway when they got there. Assuming they got there. Assuming the hydraulics held. Assuming any of this worked. "Mercer, we've got another problem." Reynolds' voice was carefully controlled, which meant the problem was bad. "I'm reading fluid loss from the center hydraulic system. It's slow, but it's there. We've got maybe 15 minutes before we're flying on prayers alone." 15 minutes. They were 20 miles out, descending through 18,000 feet, and they had 15 minutes of control authority remaining. Caleb did the math. It was going to be incredibly close. "All right, new plan. We're expediting this descent. Chen, give me landing gear down." "We're still too high. Gear down now. We need the drag, and I need to know if the gear will extend with degraded hydraulics." The landing gear, 3 massive wheel assemblies that normally deployed smoothly and locked into place with reassuring solidity, descended with agonizing slowness. The indicator showed green eventually, but the delay had cost them precious time and precious hydraulic pressure. 10 miles out, descending through 12,000. The island was visible now, a dark mass against darker ocean, lit by sparse clusters of lights that marked civilization clinging to volcanic rock. The runway, their target, their goal, their desperate hope, showed as a single line of white lights barely visible against the sprawl of the island. It looked impossibly small. São Miguel Tower, United 2847. We have field in sight, commencing final approach. United 2847, you're cleared to land runway 12, winds 120 at 15, gusting 21. Emergency equipment standing by. Gusting to 21 knots. That was well above the crosswind limits for a normal landing, and absolutely suicidal for what they were about to attempt. But suicide or not, it was their only chance. Caleb began the final descent, every sense focused on the feel of the aircraft, the response of the controls, the dance between speed and altitude and glide slope. The runway was rushing up to meet them. Too fast, they were too fast. He pulled back on the throttle for engine 1, feeling the aircraft slow, but not enough, not nearly enough. Speed's good, altitude's good, but we're drifting right. Chen's voice, steady now, had found his role and was executing it perfectly. 500 feet, 400. The crosswind was pushing them sideways, and with degraded hydraulics, Caleb couldn't compensate as quickly as he needed to. The massive aircraft wallowed in the air, fighting him, fighting physics, fighting the wind that wanted to push them off the runway centerline. 300 feet, 200. The runway lights were brilliant now, rushing past on both sides, and Caleb could see the end of the runway approaching much too fast. He needed to get down, needed to bleed speed, needed to— "We're too hot," Reynolds shouted. "You need to abort." But there was nowhere to abort to. No fuel for a second attempt. No hydraulics for a go-around. This was it. One chance, one landing, one opportunity to save everyone on board or kill them all in a ball of fire and twisted metal. "Cut the engine," Caleb said, his voice absolutely flat, absolutely certain. "What?" "Cut engine 1. Now." Chen's hand moved without further question, shutting down their last functioning engine. The aircraft became a glider. No thrust, no power, just mass and momentum and gravity pulling them toward Earth. The sudden deceleration was violent. Passengers screamed as their bodies strained against seatbelts, but the speed bled off fast. Maybe too fast. They were dropping like a stone now. Caleb pulled back on the yoke with everything he had, arms burning, the control responding but slowly, so slowly, he needed lift, needed just a few more seconds. The main landing gear kissed the runway. No, kissed was too gentle a word. They slammed into the concrete with a force that blew out 2 tires instantly. The aircraft bouncing, bucking, Caleb fighting to keep the nose up, keep them from cartwheeling, keep them alive for just a few more seconds. They hit again, harder, and this time they stayed down, the remaining tires screaming, smoking, and then Caleb deployed the thrust reversers on the dead engines, using the last of the aircraft's momentum to slow them, feeling the massive machine fighting him every inch, wanting to skid, wanting to spin, wanting to kill them all. The end of the runway was approaching at horrifying speed. They'd run out of runway. They were going to run out of runway. There was no way— Caleb stood on the brakes with everything he had, every muscle in his body screaming, and the 777 began to slow, just barely, just enough. They stopped. They stopped with what might have been 20 feet to spare, the nose of the aircraft hanging over the grass at the runway's end, the ocean visible beyond, dark and hungry and waiting for them to fail. But they hadn't failed. For 3 heartbeats, nobody in the cockpit moved. They just breathed, just existed, just processed the fact that they were still alive. Then Reynolds started laughing, not humor, but release, pure adrenalized relief. "You crazy son of a—" The rest was cut off by the sound of the cabin erupting. Through the closed cockpit door, they could hear it. Screams, sobs, shouts. The sound of 278 people realizing they'd just survived the unsurvivable. Caleb sat in the captain's seat, his hands still gripping the controls, his whole body shaking now that the immediate crisis was over. He'd done it. They'd done it. Everyone was alive. "Maisie," he whispered, and then he was moving, unbuckling, standing on legs that barely wanted to support him, heading for the cockpit door. Chen grabbed his arm. "Sir, we should—" "My daughter," Caleb said, and the raw need in his voice cut through any protocol or procedure. I promised her." Reynolds opened the cockpit door. The scene in the cabin was chaos. Passengers crying, hugging strangers, laughing with the particular hysteria of people who'd just looked death in the face and lived. Flight attendants were trying to maintain order, running through post-landing procedures, but mostly just managing the emotional explosion happening in the aluminum tube they'd somehow brought safely to Earth. Caleb moved through it, barely seeing any of it, his eyes scanning the rows, looking for seat 8B, looking for— "Daddy!" Maisie was out of her seatbelt, against all rules, but he couldn't care about rules right now, and running down the aisle, Mr. Buttons clutched in one hand, her face streaked with tears. She slammed into him at full speed, and he caught her, lifting her up, holding her so tight he was probably hurting her, but he couldn't loosen his grip, couldn't let go, couldn't process that she was here and safe, and they were both alive. "You came back," she sobbed into his shoulder. "You promised, and you came back." "Always, baby. Always." His voice broke on the words. "I will always come back to you." Around them, passengers were watching, and slowly the chaos quieted. They'd seen this man bored, The tired dad in the hoodie, nobody special, nobody important. They doubted him when he walked forward. Some had protested, insisted he wasn't qualified, wasn't capable. Now they watched him hold his daughter and realized exactly what had just happened, exactly who had saved their lives. The elderly woman Caleb had helped with her luggage was crying openly. "That's the man who helped me at O'Hare. I told him he was a good father." In first class, Vanessa Caldwell sat very still, her expensive blazer rumpled, her perfect composure shattered. She'd blocked him. She'd questioned his qualifications, planted seeds of doubt, almost prevented him from reaching the cockpit. She'd looked at him and seen someone not worth her time, someone who couldn't possibly matter. She'd never been more wrong about anything in her life. The emergency services were boarding now, paramedics for Morrison, procedures to run, reports to file. But before any of that could happen, something spontaneous began. It started with a single person clapping, just one passenger expressing what words couldn't capture. Then another joined, and another, and within seconds the entire cabin was erupting in applause, standing, cheering, crying and clapping and celebrating the quiet man in the hoodie who'd saved them all. Caleb barely heard it. He was kneeling on the aircraft floor, his daughter in his arms, his face buried in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, knowing that he'd kept his promise. He'd come back. He'd brought them all back. And in that moment, surrounded by the thunder of applause and the chaos of survival, Caleb Mercer understood something fundamental. He'd spent 12 years thinking he'd walked away from who he was, thinking he'd traded his identity for fatherhood. But tonight he'd learned that you never stop being who you are. You just find new ways to show it. He was a father, yes, but he was also a pilot. He was also a protector. He was also someone who couldn't watch people drown without jumping in, no matter how cold the water, no matter how impossible the odds. The aircraft was still and quiet now, just the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of emergency vehicles. Outside the windows, São Miguel waited. Just another island, just another runway, just another place that would fade into the background of everyone's lives once the immediate crisis passed. But for the people on United 2847, for the 280 souls who just brushed up against the edge of death and stepped back, this island would always mean something more. It would mean the place where a man in a hoodie kept his promise to his daughter. The place where ordinary became extraordinary. The place where they learned that heroes don't always look the part. Maisie pulled back just enough to look at her father's face, her small hands on his stubbled cheeks. "Daddy, you saved everyone. We all saved each other, baby. That's what people do." "Can we go home now?" Caleb laughed, the sound catching in his throat. "Yeah, sweetie, we can go home. But first there would be questions, procedures, investigations. First there would be statements and reports, and the slow machinery of crisis response grinding through its necessary steps. First there would be Captain Morrison being evacuated to the hospital, and First Officer Chen regaining his composure, and Commander Reynolds shaking Caleb's hand with a grip that said everything words couldn't. And first, there would be Vanessa Caldwell, standing at the front of the business class cabin, her expensive composure in tatters, her certainty shattered, her careful assessments revealed as exactly what they were. The quick judgments of someone who'd forgotten that you can't measure worth by looking at clothes or counting dollars or checking credentials. She wanted to apologize. She needed to apologize. But looking at the man holding his daughter, seeing the way he'd already moved past her doubts and dismissals and rejections, she understood that her apology would mean nothing compared to what he'd already proven. Some things you couldn't explain away. Some mistakes you just had to carry. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean whispered against volcanic stone, and above, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the drama that had just played out beneath them. Another night, another crisis, another impossible thing made possible by ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when it mattered most. And in Seat 8B, surrounded by the debris of survival, the dropped oxygen masks, the scattered personal items, the evidence of panic that had come and gone, Mr. Buttons the teddy bear sat alone, waiting patiently for his girl to come back and claim him, a silent witness to the night when everything changed and somehow, impossibly, everyone survived. The story wasn't over yet. This was just the landing, the immediate crisis resolved, the catastrophe averted, the worst outcomes avoided. What came after would be different, slower, more complicated in ways that emergency landings never were. But for now, in this moment, there was just a father and his daughter, together and alive, proving once again that the most powerful force in the world isn't technology or training or credentials. It's a promise, kept. The hours that followed the landing blurred together in a strange mixture of adrenaline crash and bureaucratic necessity. Caleb sat in a small office at the São Miguel airport, Maisie curled against his side, half asleep, while Portuguese officials and airline representatives cycled through with questions that all sounded the same. What happened? When did you know? How did you assess the situation? Walk us through your decisions. He answered each question the same way he'd flown the approach, methodically, without embellishment, sticking to facts that could be verified. Yes, he was qualified. Yes, he understood the risks. No, he didn't consider himself a hero, just someone who'd done what needed doing. Commander Reynolds sat across from him during most of it, occasionally interjecting to clarify technical details or confirm Caleb's account. The older man had appointed himself as something between witness and advocate, and Caleb was grateful for it. Without Reynolds' confirmation, Caleb suspected these interviews would have been far more adversarial. Lieutenant Commander Mercer's actions were textbook emergency response, Reynolds said for what felt like the 100th time to yet another investigator. He identified the problem, made the correct assessment, and executed a landing that, frankly, I'm not sure I could have pulled off myself. The FAA and NTSB can verify his credentials. Everything he did tonight was by the book. Except it wasn't entirely by the book. And Caleb knew it. Shutting down that last engine on approach had been a calculated risk that violated about 6 different safety protocols. But sometimes the book got you killed. And sometimes survival meant writing your own rules in real time and hoping they held together long enough to matter. Captain Morrison had been transported to the island's medical facility with a concussion and 3 stitches in his scalp. First Officer Chen was in another office giving his own statement, probably still trying to process what had happened. The passengers had been moved to a makeshift holding area in the terminal while the airline arranged hotels and alternate flights. 280 people who'd boarded expecting a routine red-eye to London, now stranded on a Portuguese island in the middle of the Atlantic because their aircraft had decided to come apart at the worst possible moment. Through the office window, Caleb could see them, clusters of passengers talking in low voices, some crying, some laughing with the particular edge that came from surviving something that should have killed you. He recognized faces from the cabin, the young couple who'd been holding hands, the businessman who'd gone gray, the woman who'd been praying in Spanish, and standing slightly apart from the others, still wearing her expensive blazer despite it being nearly dawn, was Vanessa Caldwell. She was on her phone, probably rearranging whatever high-powered meetings she'd missed by being alive instead of dead. But every few minutes, her eyes would track to the office where Caleb sat, and the expression on her face was complicated in ways he didn't have energy to decode. Mr. Mercer, if we could just go over the hydraulic failure sequence one more time. Can we do this later? Caleb's patience, which had held through hours of questioning, was finally fraying. My daughter needs sleep, I need sleep, and I've told you everything I know 3 times already. The NTSB will do a full investigation. They'll pull the flight data recorder, analyze every second, and give you a report that's a lot more reliable than my memory right now. The investigator, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who'd introduced himself as someone important whose title Caleb had immediately forgotten, looked affronted. Mr. Mercer, this is a serious incident. We need to establish— What you need to establish is that everyone walked away alive. Reynolds' voice carried an edge of command that made the investigator's protest die in his throat. This young man just flew a crippled aircraft through conditions that would have terrified veteran pilots, landed it safely with no fatalities, and has been answering your questions for 6 hours straight while his daughter falls asleep on a plastic chair. Unless you're planning to charge him with something, I suggest you let him get some rest. The investigator looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Reynolds' expression, the particular look of a man who'd spent decades dealing with bureaucrats and had run completely out of patience for their nonsense, made him back down. Very well, but we'll need a full written statement, and the NTSB will want to interview you. Fine. Give me a hotel room and 12 hours of sleep, and I'll write you a novel. Caleb stood carefully, adjusting his grip on Maisie so she didn't wake. She was getting too big to carry like this, but tonight he didn't care. Tonight she could be 5 years old again, small enough to tuck against his chest, close enough that he could feel every breath she took. An airline representative appeared, different from the others, this one wearing an expression of professional concern that might have even been genuine. She was probably mid-40s, with the competent air of someone who dealt with crises regularly and had gotten good at it. Mr. Mercer, I'm Patricia Santos, United Airlines Emergency Response Coordinator for this region. I want to personally thank you for your actions tonight. The company will, of course, cover all your expenses here on the island, and we're arranging first-class accommodations for your rescheduled flight to London whenever you feel ready to travel. Caleb almost laughed. First-class accommodations. 12 hours ago, he'd been in seat 8B, economy, middle section, the place they put people who couldn't afford better. Now, suddenly, the airline was falling over itself to upgrade him. Just a hotel room is fine. We just need to sleep. Of course, absolutely. I have a car waiting to take you to the Grand Hotel. We've reserved their best suite. Anything you need, just call the front desk and tell them to bill the airline. The Grand Hotel turned out to be exactly what it sounded like. A sprawling resort property with manicured gardens and an ocean view that would have been spectacular if Caleb had any energy left to appreciate it. The suite had 2 bedrooms, a living area larger than his entire apartment back in Chicago, and the kind of luxurious bathroom fixtures that made him acutely aware of how he looked in the mirror. Exhausted, still wearing the same clothes he'd boarded in, stubble now verging on actual beard, eyes hollowed out from adrenaline and stress. He got Maisie into bed first, tucking her under covers that probably cost more than his monthly rent, making sure Mr. Buttons was positioned exactly where she needed him. She stirred slightly as he kissed her forehead. Love you, Daddy. Love you too, baby. Sleep now. Then he stumbled into the shower and stood under water hot enough to hurt, letting it wash away the sweat and fear and the particular smell of terror that had permeated the cockpit. His hands were shaking, delayed reaction, adrenaline crash, the body finally processing what the mind had compartmentalized during crisis. He braced himself against the tile and let the shaking run its course, let himself feel everything he'd pushed aside during those desperate minutes when feeling anything would have meant failure. They could have died. All of them. One wrong calculation, one failed system at the wrong moment, one decision that looked good in theory but fell apart in practice, and Maisie would be dead. The elderly woman would be dead. The young couple, the businessman, Chen, Reynolds, all 280 souls he'd held in his hands, gone. Scattered across the Atlantic or smeared across a too-short runway, reduced to statistics and investigation reports, and grief that would echo through families for generations. But they hadn't died. Somehow, impossibly, they'd lived. Caleb didn't know how long he stood in that shower, but eventually the water started running cold and he forced himself to move. He dried off with towels thick enough to be blankets, put on the hotel robe that had been provided, and checked on Maisie one more time before collapsing into his own bed. Sleep claimed him instantly, pulling him under into dreams that were fractured and dark, the sound of alarms, the feel of controls going dead under his hands, the sight of ocean rushing up to meet them. He woke twice, heart pounding, convinced they were falling, before reality reasserted itself and he remembered. They'd landed. They were safe. Maisie was asleep in the next room, breathing steady and even. The third time he woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows and someone was knocking on the suite door. Caleb dragged himself out of bed, pulled on the clothes he'd been wearing, he had nothing else, and opened the door to find a hotel staff member holding a rolling rack of clothing. Mr. Mercer, the airline sent these for you and your daughter. They thought you might need fresh clothes. The woman's English carried a Portuguese accent that made the words musical. They also sent this. She handed him an envelope. Inside was a credit card with his name embossed on it and a note. For any incidental expenses during your stay, no limit. Thank you for bringing our passengers home safely. Patricia Santos, United Airlines. No limit. Caleb stared at the card, at the casual assumption that he'd want to use it, that he'd feel comfortable spending an airline's money on things he couldn't afford on his own. It felt wrong somehow, like accepting payment for something you shouldn't have to be paid for. He'd saved lives because lives needed saving, not because he expected compensation. But looking at the rack of clothes, actual quality items, not cheap replacements, he thought about Maisie waking up in yesterday's travel clothes, about having to put her back in the same outfit she'd been terrified in. And he reconsidered. Maybe this wasn't payment. Maybe this was just practical necessity wrapped in corporate guilt. He took the card. The clothes fit surprisingly well, which suggested someone had looked at him carefully enough to estimate his size. Button-down shirt, comfortable jeans, actual shoes instead of the worn sneakers he'd been living in. For Maisie, they'd sent a selection of dresses and casual outfits that would have made her squeal with delight under normal circumstances. When she woke up an hour later, groggy and confused about where they were, Caleb kept his explanation simple. "We're on an island, baby. We're safe. We'll get to London soon, but for now we're just resting here. Can we see the ocean?" After breakfast. The hotel's restaurant was nearly empty at this hour. Late morning, past the breakfast rush, too early for lunch. Caleb and Maisie sat at a table by the window, overlooking gardens that descended in terraces toward the sea. The menu was in Portuguese and English, with prices that made Caleb's eyes widen before he remembered the credit card in his pocket. Maisie ordered pancakes and orange juice. Caleb got coffee and eggs and tried not to think about how long it had been since he'd eaten. Food had been the last thing on his mind during the landing and the interrogation afterward, but now his body was insisting that it needed fuel. They were halfway through breakfast when Caleb noticed the other diners starting to recognize him. It started with whispers, then furtive glances, then a middle-aged man approaching their table with the particular nervousness of someone doing something outside their comfort zone. "Excuse me, are you the pilot? From last night?" Caleb set down his coffee. "I helped land the plane, yes. My wife and I, we were on that flight, seats 12C and 12D. The man's voice cracked slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you. My daughter's getting married next month. If you hadn't—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The unspoken ending hung in the air between them, heavy with all the futures that might have been erased. "I'm glad you're going to be there for her wedding," Caleb said quietly. "Is there anything we can do? Anything at all? Just enjoy the island. Take your wife for a walk on the beach. Appreciate being alive." The man nodded, understanding that anything else would be too much, and retreated to his own table. But the interaction had been noticed, and within minutes another passenger approached, then another. People from the flight, recognizing him now in daylight, wanting to express gratitude or disbelief, or just to confirm that the quiet man in the hoodie had really done what they remembered. Maisie watched with wide eyes as stranger after stranger thanked her father, some crying, some trying to press money or gifts on him that he politely refused. She didn't fully understand what had happened. She knew Daddy had flown the plane, knew they'd landed safely, but the magnitude of it, the reality that her father had saved all these people, was still beyond her 7-year-old comprehension. "Daddy, why is everyone being so nice?" "Because something scary happened, and we all got through it together." It was the simplest explanation he could offer, and maybe the truest one. They'd all been passengers on the same flight toward death, and somehow they'd arrived at life instead. That created a bond, temporary maybe, but real in the moment. One of the approaching passengers was Vanessa Caldwell. She'd changed out of the expensive blazer into resort casual, linen pants, silk blouse, the kind of effortlessly expensive look that came from having money and taste and the confidence to wear both comfortably. But her confidence seemed shaken this morning, her usual polish dimmed by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Mr. Mercer." She stood at a careful distance from their table, as if afraid of intruding. "I don't want to interrupt your breakfast, but I was hoping I might speak with you for a moment." Caleb glanced at Maisie, who was focused on drowning her pancakes in syrup and paying no attention to the adults. "All right." Vanessa pulled out a chair and sat, but perched on the edge like she might need to leave quickly. Up close, Caleb could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were slightly red, her makeup imperfect in a way that suggested she'd put it on without her usual care. "I need to apologize," she said directly, no preamble or hedging. "Last night, when you tried to help, I blocked you. I questioned your qualifications. I could have—" She took a breath, steadying herself. "If the flight attendant had listened to me instead of you, we would all be dead. I nearly killed 280 people because I looked at you and decided you weren't important enough to matter. Caleb studied her, this woman who'd assessed him so quickly and dismissed him so completely. She was being honest now. He could see it in the way she held herself, vulnerable in a way that probably didn't come naturally to her. And he appreciated the honesty, even if the apology didn't erase what had happened. "You were scared," he said simply. "Fear makes people do stupid things. I don't hold it against you." "You should." Her voice was fierce with self-recrimination. "I'm a lawyer. I make my living reading people, assessing credibility, determining who's telling the truth. And I looked at you and saw someone in a cheap hoodie with a sleeping kid and decided you couldn't possibly be capable. That's not fear. That's prejudice. That's me being exactly the kind of person I claim not to be." Maisie looked up from her pancakes, suddenly interested. "You're the lady who was mean to Daddy." Vanessa's face went pale. Yes, I was, and I'm very sorry." "You shouldn't judge people by their clothes," Maisie said with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old who'd been taught this lesson and believed it completely. "Miss Garcia says that's not nice." "Miss Garcia is very wise," Vanessa said quietly. "And you're right. It wasn't nice, and I'm sorry. It's okay. Daddy says everyone makes mistakes." Maisie returned to her pancakes, the matter settled in her mind with the beautiful simplicity of childhood forgiveness. Caleb and Vanessa sat in silence for a moment, the weight of adult consequences hanging between them in a way that Maisie's easy forgiveness couldn't quite dispel. "I've been thinking about it all night," Vanessa said finally. "About how many times I've made that same assessment. How many people I've looked at and decided weren't worth my attention because they didn't fit my mental image of success or competence or importance. How many opportunities I've missed. How many people I've hurt because I was too busy being sure of my own judgment to question whether it might be wrong. What will you do about it?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "I don't know. Try to do better?" That sounds inadequate, doesn't it? It's a start. Vanessa reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Thick, expensive cardstock with embossed lettering that probably cost more per card than Caleb spent on groceries in a week. "This is my direct line. If you or your daughter ever need anything, legal help, references, just someone to return a favor, please call. I mean that sincerely." Caleb took the card, more because refusing it would be awkward than because he had any intention of using it. "Thank you." She stood to leave, then paused. "You have an extraordinary daughter, Mr. Mercer, and for what it's worth, she's right about you. You're exactly the kind of person everyone should aspire to be." After she left, Maisie looked at her father with a seriousness that didn't match her syrup-sticky face. "Daddy, are we famous now?" "No, baby. We're just us." But even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. Already he'd noticed phone cameras pointed in their direction, passengers taking surreptitious photos. The age of privacy was over. By tonight his face would probably be on social media, the story spreading, his identity no longer his own to control. The thought made him tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. They spent the rest of the day trying to be normal tourists on an abnormal vacation. Caleb took Maisie down to the beach, let her play in the sand and splash in the gentle waves that rolled up onto volcanic black stone. She found shells and declared them treasures, built a lopsided castle that the tide immediately began reclaiming, laughed with the uncomplicated joy of a child who'd been terrified and was now safe and didn't need to understand anything more complex than that. Caleb sat on the sand and watched her, feeling the sun on his face, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of one night. 12 years he'd been out of the cockpit, 12 years of deliberate distance from that life, from that identity, from the particular rush that came from pushing machines to their limits and yourself past them. He thought he'd successfully walked away, thought he'd transformed himself from Lieutenant Commander Mercer into just Caleb, just Dad, just a guy who coded websites during nap time and made mac and cheese for dinner and found meaning in the small daily victories of single parenthood. But last night had proven that transformation was never quite as complete as he'd believed. The training was still there, buried but intact. The instincts were still sharp, the knowledge still accessible. He'd thought he'd left that person behind when Sarah died, and suddenly being a father became the only thing that mattered. Instead, he'd just learned to carry both versions of himself at once, The pilot and the dad, the hero and the ordinary man, the person who could land a crippled aircraft, and the person who packed juice boxes and remembered to check for monsters under the bed. "Daddy, look!" Maisie held up a shell, something dark and spiral that had survived the ocean's tumbling. "Can we keep it?" "Of course, baby." She ran back to her castle, incorporating the shell into its defenses, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest. This was enough. This moment, this beach, this child who loved him and trusted him and thought his greatest accomplishment was finding shells with her instead of saving hundreds of lives. This was enough. His phone buzzed. He'd turned it on that morning for the first time since landing and immediately regretted it. 47 missed calls, 63 text messages, emails beyond counting, news organizations, aviation forums, old squadron mates who'd seen his name in preliminary reports. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, wanted his version of events, wanted to make him into something more than he was. One text message stood out, though. It was from Reynolds. "FAA and NTSB have cleared you of any procedural violations. They're calling it textbook emergency response. You're in the clear, Mercer." "Well done." Caleb stared at the message for a long time. Cleared of procedural violations. As if that mattered. As if the most important thing was whether he'd followed the right sequence in the checklist rather than whether everyone had walked away alive. But he understood what Reynolds was really saying. You won't be blamed. When the investigation finished and the reports were filed and the story became history, his name would be associated with success rather than failure. People would remember the landing, not the risk. The outcome, not the terror. That was something, at least. Another message came through while he was reading. This one from Patricia Santos at United Airlines. "Mr. Mercer, when you're ready to continue to London, please let me know. We've arranged first-class accommodations on tomorrow's flight if that works for you. Also, the airline's CEO would like to speak with you personally if you're willing. No pressure, just gratitude. Patricia. First-class accommodations. The CEO's personal thanks. All the recognition and reward that came from doing something remarkable while people were watching." Caleb thought about Seat 8B in economy, about the single backpack and the patched jeans and the careful budgeting that had made this trip possible at all. Thought about the life he'd built in the wreckage of Sarah's death, small and constrained and focused entirely on making sure Maisie had everything she needed, even when that meant he went without. Then he thought about the credit card in his pocket with no limit, about first-class flights and grateful CEOs, and a world that suddenly wanted to shower him with rewards for being exactly who he'd always been. It felt wrong. It felt like payment for something that shouldn't have a price. But it also felt like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to refuse every kindness that came his way, didn't have to punish himself for surviving when Sarah hadn't, didn't have to make being a single father mean being a martyr. "Daddy!" Maisie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "The castle's getting eaten." He looked up to see the tide advancing, waves starting to lap at the base of her construction. In minutes it would be gone, all her careful work erased by water that didn't care about the effort she'd invested. "Should we save it?" he called back. She considered this, squinting at her castle, weighing options with the seriousness that children brought to everything they deemed important. Then she shook her head. "No, let the ocean have it. We can build a better one tomorrow." And maybe that was the lesson, Caleb thought. Maybe that was what he needed to learn from all of this. You couldn't save everything. You couldn't hold on to the past no matter how tightly you gripped. Sometimes you had to let the waves take what they wanted and trust that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to build something better. He stood up, brushed sand from his borrowed jeans, and walked down to where Maisie stood at the water's edge, watching her castle dissolve into foam and stone. He took her hand, and together they watched the ocean reclaim their work. And somehow it felt less like loss and more like transformation. Behind them, the Grand Hotel rose white and pristine against volcanic hills. Tomorrow they would fly to London, to a wedding and a life that continued beyond crisis. Tomorrow there would be more questions, more interviews, more people wanting pieces of his story. But today there was just this, a father and daughter standing at the edge of the world, alive against all odds, learning together that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let go of what you'd been and trust what came next. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in colors that had no names, and Maisie leaned against his leg, tired and happy and safe. Caleb felt the weight of her trust, the responsibility he carried, and underneath it all, the quiet knowledge that he'd done something right. Not just landing the plane, but choosing, every single day for 12 years, to be the kind of father who kept his promises. The kind of person who helped elderly women with their luggage and treated flight attendants with respect and raised a daughter who believed that goodness mattered more than status. That was the real heroism, he thought, not the dramatic landing that everyone would remember, but the thousand small choices that had made him into someone capable of making the right decision when it counted most. The ocean whispered against volcanic stone, eternal and indifferent, and somewhere in its depths were all the versions of this night that had ended differently. All the parallel worlds where he'd hesitated or failed or made one wrong choice that cost everything. But in this world, in this timeline, in this particular slice of infinite possibility, everyone had lived. And that, Caleb decided as he watched his daughter chase retreating waves, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. They flew to London 2 days later, and the difference between this flight and the last one was almost surreal. First class was a different world. Seats that reclined into actual beds, flight attendants who remembered your name, food served on real plates instead of plastic trays. Maisie was delighted by everything, spinning in her seat to take it all in, pressing the call button just to see what would happen, asking questions about every feature until Caleb had to gently remind her that other passengers were trying to sleep. "But Daddy, look, the TV comes out of the armrest." "I see that, baby. Keep your voice down." The flight attendant working their section was a woman in her 50s named Margaret, who'd apparently been briefed on exactly who they were. She treated Caleb with a deference that made him uncomfortable, bringing extra snacks for Maisie without being asked, checking on them constantly, making sure they had everything they needed before they knew they needed it. "Mr. Mercer, is there anything else I can get for you?" "We're fine, thank you." "Are you sure? We have ice cream, or I could bring some fresh fruit for your daughter." "Margaret," Caleb kept his voice gentle but firm, "I appreciate the attention, but you don't need to treat us differently than anyone else. We're just passengers." Something in her expression shifted, became less professional and more human. "Mr. Mercer, I've been flying for 32 years. I've seen emergencies, diversions, medical incidents, but what you did—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "My daughter flies standby sometimes, uses my benefits to travel. She could have been on that flight. Any of our families could have been. So when I say thank you, when I bring your daughter extra cookies, it's not because corporate told me to. It's because you brought people home who might not have made it otherwise." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, to the weight of gratitude that he still didn't feel he'd earned. He'd just done what needed doing, made the only choice that made sense in the moment. But for Margaret and people like her, it meant something more. It meant their families were still intact, their daughters still flying standby, their world still containing the people they loved. "You're welcome," he said finally, inadequately. The flight was smooth and uneventful, exactly what flying was supposed to be. Maisie fell asleep halfway through with Mr. Buttons clutched to her chest, her face peaceful in a way that made Caleb's throat tight. She'd been having nightmares the past 2 nights, waking up crying, asking if the plane was falling, needing reassurance that they were safe on solid ground. He'd held her through each episode, promised her that bad dreams couldn't hurt her, that they were safe now and always would be. But he'd been having his own nightmares too, though he didn't tell her that. Dreams where the runway ran out too soon, where the controls went completely dead, where he looked back to see Maisie's seat empty and knew he'd failed the one person who mattered most. He'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, and have to physically get up and check on her sleeping form to convince himself it had just been a dream. Trauma had a way of living in your body long after your mind understood you were safe. They landed at Heathrow in early morning fog, the kind of gray English weather that made Chicago's winters feel almost cheerful by comparison. Caleb had texted his friend Marcus, the groom whose wedding had prompted this whole trip, to let him know they'd been delayed but were finally arriving. Marcus had responded with a string of messages that ranged from concern to disbelief to an insistence that Caleb tell him everything over drinks. The wedding wasn't for another 3 days, which gave them time to settle in, shake off the jet lag, and pretend this was a normal vacation instead of the aftermath of near death. Marcus had arranged for them to stay in a small flat in Notting Hill, something he'd borrowed from a friend who was traveling. It was cozy and cluttered with books and had a window that looked out onto a street lined with colorful townhouses that Maisie immediately declared looked like something from a storybook. "Can we live here, Daddy? We're just visiting, baby, but it's so pretty." It was pretty, in the particular way that London neighborhoods could be. History stacked on history, modern life flowing through centuries-old streets, everything layered and complex and somehow working despite the impossibility of it all. Caleb unpacked their single bag. He'd bought a few extra things on São Miguel with the airline's credit card, but they were still traveling light and tried to figure out how to work the temperamental shower. Marcus showed up that evening with takeaway curry and enough questions to fill a book. He was exactly as Caleb remembered, tall, perpetually energetic, with the kind of infectious enthusiasm that made you want to be part of whatever he was planning. They'd flown together years ago, had been close friends before Caleb left the Navy, and had kept in touch through emails and occasional phone calls that never quite bridged the distance that geography and different lives created. "You landed a 777 with failed hydraulics." Marcus said it like he was still trying to make the words make sense. "You, the guy who swore he'd never get in a cockpit again after Sarah died." Circumstances were somewhat compelling. Compelling, right. Because watching 280 people die is just compelling. Marcus shook his head, grinning despite the gravity of what they were discussing. "You always were terrible at accepting credit for anything. Do you have any idea what people are saying? You're all over aviation forums. There's a Reddit thread with 10,000 comments. Someone's already talking about making a movie." Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. "A movie?" Dramatic recreation, survivor interviews, the whole thing. Hollywood loves this stuff. Ordinary guy turns out to be extraordinary, saves everyone, rides off into the sunset. It's got all the beats. "I don't want a movie." "Doesn't matter what you want. The story's already out there." Marcus must have seen something in Caleb's expression because his tone softened. "Hey, I'm not saying you have to participate. Just warning you that privacy might be harder to come by for a while. People want heroes, especially right now when everything feels like it's falling apart. You gave them a real one. I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who knew how to fly. Which makes you a hero to the people who would be dead if you didn't know how to fly." Marcus glanced toward the bedroom where Maisie was coloring at a small desk, deliberately out of earshot. "How's she doing?" "Nightmares, clinginess, but better than I expected, honestly. Kids are resilient." "And you?" Caleb took a long drink of water instead of answering immediately. The truth was, he didn't know how he was doing. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind something that felt like exhaustion mixed with hyper-awareness. He kept running through the landing in his mind, analyzing every decision, questioning whether he'd made the right choices or just gotten lucky. Survivor's guilt, maybe, though everyone had survived, so it wasn't quite that. More like the weight of understanding how easily it could have gone wrong. How many factors beyond his control had aligned in just the right way to make survival possible. "I'm managing," he said finally. Marcus knew him well enough not to push. "Well, you're here now. Let's try to make this a normal visit, yeah? Show Maisie the sights, eat questionable British food, pretend you're just a tourist and not the guy who's trending on Twitter." "I'm on Twitter?" "Trending worldwide. Hashtag hero in a hoodie, apparently. Someone grabbed a photo of you from the plane and it's been shared about 1,000,000 times. You look properly exhausted in it, which I think is part of the appeal. Very reluctant hero aesthetic." Caleb groaned. This was exactly what he didn't want. His face plastered across social media, strangers feeling entitled to opinions about his life. The particular violation that came from having your worst and most vulnerable moment turned into entertainment for people who'd never know what it felt like to hold the lives of 280 people in your hands. "Can we talk about something else? Tell me about the wedding. Tell me about Emma. Tell me about literally anything that isn't about São Miguel." So Marcus did, launching into stories about wedding planning disasters and future in-law complications and the particular chaos that came from trying to merge two families who'd never met before into one celebration. It was normal and mundane and exactly what Caleb needed. A reminder that life continued beyond crisis, that people still worried about seating arrangements and flower choices, and whether the band would play the right song for the first dance. They spent the next 2 days being tourists. Caleb took Maisie to the British Museum, where she was fascinated by the Egyptian mummies and terrified by the Assyrian lion sculptures. They rode the tube and got lost in the confusing maze of connections, finally surfacing near Covent Garden, where street performers were juggling fire, and Maisie declared it the most amazing thing she'd ever seen. They ate fish and chips that were genuinely good, fed pigeons in Trafalgar Square despite signs saying not to, and generally tried to experience London the way any father and daughter on vacation would. But recognition followed them everywhere. People would do double takes, pull out phones, whisper to companions while pointing in Caleb's direction. Most kept their distance, content to observe from afar, but some approached, always apologetic, always grateful, always wanting to shake his hand or tell him their story about why his actions mattered to them personally. A woman in her 20s stopped them near Buckingham Palace. "You're him, aren't you? The pilot?" Caleb was getting tired of confirming his identity, but he made himself smile. "Yes. My best friend was on that flight. She called me from the island, crying so hard I couldn't understand her at first. I thought something terrible had happened. Then she told me," the woman's voice caught, "she's the maid of honor at my wedding next month. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't done what you did, she wouldn't be. So thank you. Thank you so much." These encounters were starting to form a pattern, each one a reminder of the invisible web of connections radiating out from that single flight. Every passenger had family, friends, people who loved them and would have been devastated by their loss. Caleb had saved 280 lives directly, but indirectly he'd preserved thousands of relationships, prevented countless grief, maintained the structural integrity of families and friendships that would have been shattered by sudden death. The weight of it was almost unbearable. "Daddy, can we go see the tower where they kept the ravens?" Maisie tugged on his hand, oblivious to the emotional exchange happening above her head. "Tower of London, you mean? Sure, baby." They spent the afternoon exploring the ancient fortress, Maisie delighted by the beefeaters in their elaborate uniforms and the ravens that supposedly protected the kingdom from falling. Caleb found himself drawn to the exhibits about prisoners, people who'd been locked in these towers for years, waiting for fates they couldn't control, living in the space between life and death that trauma created. He understood that feeling now in a way he hadn't before. The crash had only lasted minutes, but in some ways he was still living in that space, still waiting for the moment when the controls would fail completely and the ocean would rise up to claim them. His body knew they were safe, but some deeper part of his brain hadn't gotten the message yet. That evening, Marcus insisted they come to a pre-wedding dinner with Emma and some of her family. It was held at a restaurant in Shoreditch, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs and the kind of aggressively hip aesthetic that made Caleb feel old and out of place. Emma turned out to be exactly as Marcus had described, warm, funny, with the kind of easy confidence that came from genuinely liking herself and not needing anyone else's validation. "So you're the famous Caleb," she said, hugging him like they were already family. "Marcus has told me so many stories, though none of them mentioned you were secretly a superhero." "I'm really not." "That's exactly what a superhero would say." She crouched down to Maisie's level. "And you must be Maisie. I heard you were very brave on the airplane." Maisie considered this seriously. "I was scared, but Daddy said he'd come back, and he did." "Well, your daddy is pretty special." The dinner was pleasant enough, good food, easy conversation, people who were interested in Caleb's story, but respectful enough not to interrogate him about it. Emma's parents were there, along with her sister and brother-in-law, and everyone made an effort to include Maisie in the conversation, asking about her school and her favorite subjects and whether she liked London. But midway through the meal, Caleb's phone started buzzing insistently. He'd been trying to ignore it all day. The constant stream of calls and messages from news organizations, aviation publications, people claiming to be documentary producers or book agents or representatives of various organizations that wanted to give him awards he didn't want. This time, though, the caller ID showed United Airlines, Patricia Santos, the emergency response coordinator. He excused himself from the table and stepped outside to take the call. "Mr. Mercer, I apologize for calling so late. Are you available to talk?" "What's wrong?" Because something had to be wrong for her to call him directly during what should be his vacation time. "Nothing's wrong exactly, but we've had a development that I thought you should know about immediately." The passengers from Flight 2847, they've organized, created a group, started collecting money, planning something. I don't have all the details, but from what I understand, they're trying to thank you in some significant way. Caleb felt his stomach drop. I don't want their money. I understand that. But, Mr. Mercer, you should know that this is coming from a place of genuine gratitude. These people want to do something meaningful. The airline can't stop them, and honestly, we wouldn't want to. What you did, it matters to them. What I did was land a plane. That's not worth... With respect, Mr. Mercer, you don't get to decide what it's worth to them. You gave them their lives back. You gave them the chance to see their grandchildren born, to finish degrees, to get married, to keep living. That has whatever value they decide to give it. The words hit harder than Caleb expected. He leaned against the brick wall of the restaurant, feeling the cold London night seep through his borrowed jacket, trying to process what she was telling him. Passengers organizing, collecting money, planning something that would force him to confront the magnitude of what had happened in a way he'd been carefully avoiding. When? He asked finally. They're hoping to meet with you when you return to Chicago. There's going to be a gathering, formal, I think. They want to present you with something, though I don't know the specifics. The airline is providing some support, arranging the venue, but this is entirely passenger-driven. I can refuse. You can, but I think you'd regret it. These people need closure, Mr. Mercer. They need to thank you in person, to make this gesture, to transform what could have been trauma into something positive. Refusing them, that might hurt more than you realize. Caleb closed his eyes, seeing Maisie's face in his mind, remembering her question on the beach. Are we famous now? He'd said no, said they were just them, but that had been a lie even then. The moment he'd walked forward on that aircraft, he'd stopped being just Caleb and become something else. A symbol. A story. A person who existed in other people's narratives in ways he couldn't control. Fine, he said, hearing the exhaustion in his own voice. Tell them I'll be there. Thank you, Mr. Mercer, and truly from everyone at United, thank you for everything you did that night. After the call ended, Caleb stood in the cold for a few more minutes, gathering himself before going back inside. Through the restaurant window, he could see Maisie laughing at something Emma had said, her face bright with the particular joy of being included in adult conversation. She looked happy. She looked normal. And more than anything, Caleb wanted to preserve that normalcy for her, to make sure that one terrifying night didn't define the rest of her childhood. But he was starting to understand that normalcy might not be possible anymore. Not when strangers recognized them on the street. Not when passengers were organizing gatherings in his honor. Not when his face was trending worldwide and someone was talking about making movies about the worst night of his life. Inside, the dinner had moved on to dessert. Caleb slipped back into his seat next to Maisie, who immediately leaned against him, seeking the particular comfort that only he could provide. You okay, Daddy? You look sad. Just tired, baby. It's been a long day. Marcus caught his eye across the table, a question in his expression, but Caleb shook his head slightly. Not now. Not here. Later, when Maisie was asleep and they could talk properly, he'd tell Marcus about the call, about the gathering, about the way his life seemed to be spiraling away from his control despite his best efforts to hold on to it. Emma's father raised his glass. A toast to Marcus and Emma, to new beginnings, and to unexpected heroes who remind us that goodness exists even in the most terrifying moments. Everyone drank, and Caleb managed to smile, but inside he felt like he was still in that cockpit, still fighting controls that wouldn't quite respond, still desperately trying to bring everyone safely home while knowing that home meant something different now than it had before. The wedding was beautiful in the particular way that English weddings could be, held in a centuries-old church with stone walls and stained glass, followed by a reception in a country house with gardens that seemed to go on forever. Maisie was entranced by everything, especially Emma's dress, which she declared was exactly like a princess's. Caleb stood with Marcus during the ceremony, watching his friend's face as Emma walked down the aisle, seeing the kind of pure joy that made you believe in second chances and new beginnings. During his toast at the reception, Marcus insisted on mentioning Caleb. My best man is the kind of person who'd walk into fire to pull you out. I've always known that about him, But apparently everyone else needed a dramatic demonstration. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd, but Caleb saw the way some guests looked at him differently after that. Recognition dawning, whispers starting. Even here, even at his friend's wedding, he couldn't escape what had happened. Later, during the dancing, Emma's sister cornered him at the bar. "Is it true you haven't flown in 12 years? "Yes." "Then how did you know what to do?" It was a good question, one that Caleb had been asking himself. Training doesn't disappear. You can bury it, ignore it, walk away from it. But when you need it, it comes back. "Do you think you'll go back to flying, now that you know you still can?" The question caught him off guard because he hadn't let himself think about it. Flying had been his identity once, the thing that defined him and gave his life purpose. Then Sarah died, and suddenly the only thing that mattered was being present for Maisie, being the stable constant in her life, when everything else had been torn away. He couldn't do that from an aircraft carrier, couldn't be a proper father while deployed for months at a time, so he'd walked away without looking back. But now, having been back in a cockpit, having felt the familiar weight of controls in his hands, and the particular satisfaction that came from solving problems at altitude, he'd be lying if he said he hadn't missed it. Missed the clarity of it, the way everything else fell away and you existed only in the moment, in the pure challenge of keeping metal and flesh and hope airborne against all the forces trying to drag you down. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I have a daughter who needs me on the ground more than the sky needs me in the air." "Maybe. Or maybe she needs you to be happy, and maybe flying makes you happy." Before Caleb could respond to that bit of uncomfortable insight, Maisie appeared, tugging on his hand. "Daddy, can we dance?" He let her pull him onto the dance floor, where she stood on his shoes while he moved them both in approximations of proper dancing. She giggled when he spun her, clutched his hands when he dipped her dramatically, and generally made him forget about everything except this moment, this child, this perfect snapshot of happiness. This was what mattered, not the passenger's gratitude or the media attention or the questions about his future. Just this, making his daughter laugh, keeping her safe, being present for the small moments that added up to a childhood she'd remember as happy despite the grief woven through it. The song ended and another started, something slower. Around them, couples paired off. Marcus and Emma swaying together like they were the only people in the world. Emma's parents dancing with the careful consideration of people who'd been together so long, they didn't need to think about the steps. Even strangers finding partners because weddings made people want to be close to someone. "Daddy, this is the most beautiful day ever," Maisie said, her head against his chest. "Yeah, baby, it really is." And for a moment, he believed it. Believed that everything was going to be fine, that the terror of São Miguel was behind them, that life would simply continue forward in the normal way it was supposed to. Believed that being a hero meant nothing more than being a good father, and that was something he knew how to do. But later that night, after they'd returned to the borrowed flat and Maisie was asleep, Caleb found himself standing at the window, looking out at London's nighttime streets, unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. He'd tried to wall off that part of himself, the pilot, the military officer, the person who'd been trained to handle emergencies, but walls didn't work if the thing you were trying to contain was actually part of who you were. Marcus's wedding had been about new beginnings, about two people choosing to build a life together despite all the uncertainties that came with that choice. Maybe Caleb needed his own new beginning, not leaving behind who he'd been, but finally integrating all the versions of himself he'd been trying to keep separate. The problem was he didn't know how to do that. Didn't know how to be both the attentive father and the capable pilot, both the quiet man in economy and the person who could save lives when it mattered most. Those identities felt mutually exclusive, like choosing one meant abandoning the other. His phone buzzed with another message. This time it was from Commander Reynolds. "Mercer, saw you're trending again. Wedding photos, apparently. You clean up well. Listen, when you're back stateside, I'd like to talk to you about something. Could be an opportunity if you're interested. Could be nothing if you're not. Either way, let's grab coffee. You owe me for backing you up with those investigators." Reynolds. An opportunity. Caleb stared at the message, trying to imagine what Reynolds might be offering. A recommendation for a commercial airline? Consulting work? Something military adjacent that would let him use his skills without fully returning to that life. Or maybe it was nothing. Maybe Reynolds just wanted to maintain the connection, the particular bond that formed between people who'd survived something intense together. Outside, London slept and dreamed and continued its ancient existence, indifferent to one man's identity crisis. Somewhere in this city, people were being born and dying, falling in love and getting divorced, making choices that would define the rest of their lives without ever fully understanding the implications. Caleb was just one more person trying to figure out how to live with the consequences of decisions made in moments of crisis. The difference was his decisions had happened in public, had been witnessed and discussed and analyzed by strangers who felt entitled to opinions about whether he'd done enough or been brave enough or deserved the praise being heaped on him. He didn't have answers, didn't know if he should take Reynolds up on whatever offer he was hinting at, didn't know if he should attend the gathering the passengers were planning, didn't know if he should embrace this new identity or fight to return to the comfortable anonymity he'd built so carefully over the past 12 years. What he did know was that in the next room, Maisie was sleeping peacefully because he'd kept his promise. He'd come back to her. And as long as he could keep making that promise and keeping it, maybe the rest would sort itself out eventually. Or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe he'd spend the rest of his life trying to reconcile the competing demands of being both ordinary and extraordinary, both present and capable, both the quiet dad and the reluctant hero. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, he was just tired, bone-deep exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fully cure. So he did what he always did when the weight of everything became too much. He checked on Maisie one more time, made sure she was sleeping soundly, adjusted Mr. Buttons so he wouldn't fall off the bed, and then climbed into his own bed to chase whatever rest he could find before the next day brought its inevitable complications. Outside, London continued its ancient song of life and death and everything between. And somewhere over the Atlantic, aircraft flew their routine routes, passengers sleeping peacefully in their seats, trusting that the pilots would bring them safely home. Most of the time, that trust was rewarded. Most of the time, nothing went wrong. But sometimes, rarely, thankfully, the impossible happened. And when it did, people like Caleb stepped forward, did what needed doing, and then spent the rest of their lives trying to process what it meant to hold other people's futures in your hands and somehow not drop them. Sleep came eventually, though it brought dreams of falling and flying and the particular terror of responsibility that no training could fully prepare you for. But dreams ended when morning came, and morning always came, and life continued its forward momentum whether you were ready for it or not. That was both the blessing and the curse of survival. You had to keep living with it. They returned to Chicago on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind of weather that made the whole city feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something better. Caleb had never been so happy to see his apartment, small and cramped and filled with the particular clutter of single-parent life, but home in a way that luxury hotel suites and borrowed London flats could never be. Maisie ran straight to her room to check on her stuffed animals, convinced they'd missed her desperately. Caleb dropped their bag by the door and stood in the living room, taking in the familiar landscape of his life. The couch with the permanent indent where he sat every night after Maisie went to bed. The kitchen table covered in her artwork. The bookshelf Sarah had picked out years ago, still holding the mixture of his technical manuals and her poetry collections that he couldn't bring himself to move. This was real. London had been a dream, São Miguel a nightmare. But this was the life he'd built piece by piece from the wreckage of grief. His phone rang almost immediately. Patricia Santos, right on schedule. "Mr. Mercer, welcome home. I hope your flight was uneventful." "Mercifully boring, yes." "Good. I wanted to confirm the details for Saturday. The gathering will be at the Hilton downtown, starting at 2 in the afternoon. It's optional, of course, but I think you'll find it meaningful. The passengers have put together something quite special." Caleb had been trying not to think about Saturday, about facing all those people whose lives had intersected with his in the worst possible way. "Will Captain Morrison be there?" "Yes, he's recovered well. Wants to thank you personally. First Officer Chen will be there too, along with Commander Reynolds." "And how many passengers are we talking about?" There was a pause that told Caleb the answer was going to be uncomfortable. "Current RSVP count is about 160. Some couldn't make it, obviously, but the majority wanted to be there." 160 people. 160 witnesses to the night that had changed everything, all gathered in one room to do something Caleb still didn't fully understand or want. But Patricia was right. Refusing them would hurt more than attending. They needed this closure, this chance to transform terror into gratitude, and he owed them that much at least. "I'll be there." "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. And please, bring Maisie if you'd like. The passengers have asked about her specifically." After the call ended, Caleb stood holding his phone, trying to imagine what Saturday would look like. A ballroom full of strangers who weren't quite strangers, all looking at him with expectations he couldn't possibly meet, all projecting their own narratives onto what had happened, turning a series of desperate decisions into something heroic and intentional when the reality had been much messier and more terrified. "Daddy, can we have mac and cheese for dinner?" Maisie appeared in the doorway, Mr. Buttons tucked under her arm. "Sure, baby. The blue box kind?" "With hot dogs cut up in it?" "Obviously. Can't have mac and cheese without hot dogs." This was what mattered. This routine, this normalcy, this life where the biggest decision was whether to add hot dogs to boxed macaroni. He clung to it like a lifeline, letting the simple domesticity of cooking dinner and listening to Maisie chatter about her stuffed animals wash away the complications waiting for him on Saturday. They ate on the couch, watching nature documentaries, Maisie asking endless questions about why penguins couldn't fly if they were birds, and whether polar bears ever got cold. Caleb answered each question as seriously as it was asked, grateful for the distraction, for the reminder that life contained more than crisis and consequence. That night, after Maisie was asleep, Caleb finally let himself check the full extent of the media coverage he'd been avoiding. His name brought up thousands of results, news articles, opinion pieces, aviation forums analyzing his technique, social media posts praising or occasionally criticizing his decisions. Someone had created a Wikipedia page about the incident. Someone else had started a crowdfunding campaign to support the hero pilot that he absolutely didn't want and would need to figure out how to refuse. The photo Marcus had mentioned was everywhere. Caleb walking through the São Miguel airport, Maisie in his arms, both of them looking shell-shocked and exhausted. Someone had captured the exact moment when crisis became aftermath, when adrenaline gave way to the crushing weight of having survived something unsurvivable. He looked like hell in the photo, but apparently that was part of the appeal. Real heroism looked like exhaustion and rumpled hoodies, not movie star glamour. There were survivor interviews too. Passengers describing the landing in vivid detail, praising Caleb's calm competence, sharing their own terror and relief. The elderly woman he'd helped with her luggage had given a particularly moving account about the kind young man who saved us all. Vanessa Caldwell had declined most interview requests, but one quote from her had been widely circulated. "I judged him incorrectly, and I'll carry that shame for the rest of my life. He's everything I should aspire to be." Caleb closed his laptop, unable to process anymore. The person they were describing felt like a stranger, someone braver and more capable than he'd ever been. Someone who'd known exactly what to do instead of improvising desperately and hoping it worked. They were creating a legend, and he was just the flawed human being who happened to inspire it. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. Caleb worked on the website projects he'd been neglecting, trying to catch up on freelance coding work that paid the bills. Maisie returned to school, where apparently everyone now knew her father was the pilot from the news, and she'd achieved minor celebrity status among 7-year-olds who thought having a hero dad was the coolest thing imaginable. "Madison's dad works in an office," Maisie reported at dinner on Thursday. "She says your job is way better." "My job is also working on a computer, baby, just from home instead of an office." "But you fly planes too." "I flew one plane one time in an emergency. That's not the same as it being my job." "Could it be your job, if you wanted?" The question hung in the air between them, innocent on the surface but touching on something deeper that Caleb had been carefully avoiding. Could flying be his job again? Should it be? Reynolds' message about an opportunity kept nagging at him, suggesting possibilities he wasn't ready to consider. "Right now, my job is taking care of you," he said finally. "Everything else is secondary." Maisie seemed satisfied with that answer, but Caleb wasn't. The truth was more complicated. He'd been using fatherhood as an excuse to avoid confronting what he actually wanted from his life, beyond just surviving it. Sarah's death had given him permission to stop trying, to settle for good enough, to define success as simply keeping Maisie fed and loved and reasonably happy. But what happened when good enough stopped being enough? Saturday arrived with the inevitability of deadlines and dental appointments, something you couldn't avoid no matter how much you wanted to. Caleb dressed carefully in one of the new shirts the airline had provided, spent too long trying to make his hair look presentable, and eventually gave up and accepted that he was always going to look slightly disheveled no matter what he did. Maisie wore one of the dresses from São Miguel, insisting that this was a fancy occasion, and fancy occasions required fancy clothes. She'd also insisted on bringing Mr. Buttons for moral support, and Caleb didn't have the heart to argue. The Hilton downtown was exactly the kind of upscale hotel that made Caleb feel out of place. All marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and the particular hush that came from expensive acoustics. A hotel representative met them in the lobby, introduced herself as someone important, and guided them to a ballroom on the second floor. "The passengers are already gathering," she said as they walked. "There's going to be a short program, some speakers, and then they'll present you with, well, I'll let them explain. It's quite moving." She opened the ballroom doors and Caleb's breath caught. The room was full. Not 160 people, but easily more. Passengers and their families, crew members, airline representatives, and people Caleb didn't recognize but who all turned to look as he entered. The applause started immediately, building to something overwhelming, faces everywhere showing emotions too complex to name. Commander Reynolds appeared at his elbow almost instantly, a steadying presence in the chaos. "Breathe, Mercer. You've survived worse than a ballroom full of grateful people." "Have I, though?" Reynolds laughed. "Fair point. Come on, they've got a seat for you up front. Maisie can sit with you." The program started with Captain Morrison taking the microphone. He looked good considering he'd been unconscious during the actual landing. The stitches in his scalp were barely visible, and his voice was strong as he addressed the room. "I've been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years. In that time, I've handled weather, equipment failures, medical emergencies, even an engine fire once. But what happened over the Atlantic that night was beyond anything in my experience or training. When I regained consciousness in the hospital on São Miguel, the first thing they told me was that everyone had survived. The second thing was who'd landed the plane." Morrison turned to look directly at Caleb. "Lieutenant Commander Mercer, you did something extraordinary. You took a situation that should have ended in catastrophe, and somehow, through skill and courage and sheer determination, you brought everyone home. On behalf of everyone who was in that cockpit, everyone in that cabin, everyone who loves them, thank you." More applause. Caleb felt Maisie grab his hand, squeezing tight, and he focused on that small point of contact to keep himself grounded. First Officer Chen spoke next, his voice breaking slightly as he described those terrifying minutes in the cockpit. "I thought we were all going to die. I'd accepted it. Then this man walked in wearing a hoodie and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, and he took controls that were barely responding and somehow made them work. He saved my life. He saved all our lives." The speeches continued, Reynolds talking about Caleb's technical competence, Patricia Santos representing the airline's gratitude. Even Vanessa Caldwell taking the microphone to publicly acknowledge her mistake in doubting him. Each speaker added another layer to the legend being constructed, another piece of narrative that transformed what had happened from desperate improvisation into deliberate heroism. Then they called up a woman Caleb recognized from the flight, the young woman who'd been traveling to be maid of honor at her best friend's wedding. "The passengers wanted to do something meaningful to express our gratitude," she said, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. "We started a collection. Everyone from the flight contributed, along with family members and friends who understood what you gave us. We've raised $63,000. Caleb felt his stomach drop. $63,000. That was more money than he'd made in 2 years of freelance coding, more than his entire emergency fund, more than he could process in a room full of people watching his reaction. "We know you might not want to accept it," the woman continued. "We know you'll say you were just doing what anyone would do, even though we all know that's not true. So we're offering you a choice. Accept the money for yourself and your daughter, or direct us to donate it somewhere meaningful. Either way, we need you to know what your actions meant to us." Caleb stood slowly, aware of every eye in the room tracking his movement. Maisie was watching him with that particular intensity children had when they were trying to understand adult emotions they didn't quite grasp. He thought about $63,000, about what it could mean. Maisie's college fund fully funded, Years of financial stress lifted, the freedom to make choices based on something other than desperate necessity. He thought about the credit card with no limit, about first-class flights and luxury hotel suites, and all the ways the world wanted to reward him for doing something he'd had no choice but to do. Then he thought about Captain Morrison's family, watching their husband and father get loaded into an ambulance with a head injury that could have been fatal. Thought about the years Morrison had spent keeping passengers safe, the experience and dedication that had made him the kind of captain who stayed conscious just long enough to realize they needed help. Captain Morrison was injured while doing his job, Caleb said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. He's got medical bills, recovery time, a family that depended on his income. I'd like half of this money to go to his family, to help cover what insurance won't, and to thank him for years of service that made last week possible. Morrison's face showed surprise and something deeper, a recognition of being seen, being valued, being remembered in the story that everyone wanted to be only about Caleb. The other half, Caleb continued, I'd like to accept, not for me, but for my daughter. Her mother died 4 years ago, and I've been trying to give her a stable life ever since. This money means her college is paid for. It means she has security even if something happens to me. It means I can give her the future her mother would have wanted for her. He looked down at Maisie, who was watching him with those enormous brown eyes that were Sarah's legacy. So thank you. Not because I deserve it, I don't think I do, but because you're giving my daughter opportunities she wouldn't have had otherwise, and that matters more than anything else. The applause this time was different, softer, more intimate, the sound of people understanding that they'd just witnessed something genuine instead of rehearsed. Several people were crying openly. Morrison crossed the room to shake Caleb's hand, his grip firm and his eyes bright with unshed tears. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. You've been flying people safely for 2 decades. That matters too. The formal program ended and the gathering became more casual. People approaching to share their stories, to take photos, to connect the abstract concept of the pilot with the reality of this quiet man who looked uncomfortable with all the attention. Caleb endured it because refusing would hurt people who'd already been hurt enough. But every minute felt like standing in front of a spotlight he couldn't escape. The elderly woman whose luggage he'd helped approached with tears streaming down her face. I told you that you were a good father. I had no idea how right I was. The young couple who'd been holding hands during the crisis came over together, their fingers still intertwined. We got engaged last week, the woman said. We'd been dating for 4 years, kept putting it off because it never seemed like the right time. Then we almost died, and we realized we were done waiting. So thank you for giving us the chance to stop wasting time. Each story was a window into lives that would have ended if things had gone differently. Each person represented dozens more, family members, friends, future children who would exist because Caleb had made the right choices in the worst circumstances. The weight of it was staggering. Maisie stayed close to his side through all of it, her small hand in his, occasionally tugging when she got bored or overwhelmed. Finally, during a brief lull, she looked up at him with unusual seriousness. Daddy, are you sad? No, baby, just tired. Everyone keeps saying you're a hero, are you? Caleb crouched down to her level, ignoring the room full of people who could probably hear every word. I did something that needed doing. That doesn't make me a hero. It just makes me someone who was in the right place at the right time with the right training. But everyone says, everyone needs heroes, Maisie. They need to believe that when bad things happen, someone will step up and fix them. So they turn people like me into something bigger than we are because it's comforting. But the truth is much simpler. I'm your dad. I know how to fly planes, and when people needed help, I helped them. That's all. She considered this with the gravity of childhood logic. Miss Garcia says helping people is the most important thing you can do. Miss Garcia is right. Then maybe you are a hero, just a regular one. Caleb smiled despite the exhaustion pressing down on him. Okay, a regular hero. I can live with that. Commander Reynolds found him later as the gathering was winding down and people were starting to leave with promises to stay in touch that might or might not be kept. You handled that well. Better than I expected, honestly. You expected me to bolt? The thought crossed my mind. Reynolds pulled out his phone, scrolling to find something. Listen, I mentioned I had an opportunity to discuss. I meant it. There's a program, Civilian Oversight for Military Aviation Training. They need people with real-world experience, people who understand both military and commercial aviation. It's consulting work, part-time, flexible schedule. You could do most of it remotely. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. Why are you offering this to me? Because you're qualified and because you clearly need something more than what you're doing now. I watched you in that cockpit, Mercer. You came alive in a way that people don't when they're just going through the motions. You belong in aviation, one way or another. This would let you stay involved without sacrificing time with your daughter. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. Call me when you're ready to talk details. Reynolds clapped him on the shoulder. You did good today. Morrison's family, that was classy. Not everyone would have thought of that. After Reynolds left, Caleb found himself alone for the first time all afternoon, Maisie having been temporarily claimed by one of the flight attendants from the flight who was showing her how to make balloon animals from napkins. He stood at the ballroom window looking out at Chicago spread below, trying to process everything that had happened. $63,000. Half of it going to Maisie's future, securing the education and opportunities that Sarah would have wanted for her. The other half going to Morrison, acknowledging that heroism came in many forms, including 23 years of routine flights that ended safely, a consulting position that would let him stay connected to aviation without abandoning his daughter, a way to be both things at once instead of choosing between them, recognition from people whose lives he'd saved, gratitude that felt too large to accept but too sincere to refuse, and underneath it all, the slowly dawning realization that maybe he'd been wrong about something fundamental. Maybe walking away from flying hadn't been about protecting Maisie. Maybe it had been about protecting himself, from the risk, from the responsibility, from the possibility of failing someone else the way he'd failed to save Sarah when that drunk driver ran the red light. But you couldn't save everyone. Sometimes terrible things happen to good people, and there was nothing you could do except survive it and try to build something meaningful from the wreckage. Daddy, look! Maisie ran up with a balloon giraffe, its neck impossibly long and wobbly. Miss Angela made it for me. That's amazing, baby. What do you say? Thank you, Miss Angela. The flight attendant smiled, and Caleb recognized her now. She'd been one of the crew working economy during the flight, had been professional and calm, even when everything was falling apart. Thank you, Mr. Mercer, for everything. How many times had he heard that today? Thank you for everything. As if he'd done something more than follow his training and make desperate choices that happened to work out. As if he'd been operating from some deep well of courage instead of just terror and determination to keep a promise to his daughter. But maybe that's what courage was, being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Not because you were fearless, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The gathering finally ended as the hotel staff started the subtle hints that they needed the ballroom for the next event. Caleb collected the paperwork for the money. Half would be transferred to Morrison's account, half to an education fund being set up for Maisie. He shook hands with people whose names he'd already forgotten, accepted business cards from others who wanted to stay in touch, and generally endured the prolonged goodbye that large gatherings always required. Outside, the Chicago evening was cool and clear, the kind of weather that made you remember why you lived here despite the brutal winters. Caleb took a deep breath of air that didn't smell like hotel ballroom, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. Can we get ice cream? Maisie asked, because in the logic of 7-year-olds, formal gatherings were exhausting and required frozen dairy products as recovery. Sure, baby, there's a place 2 blocks from here. They walked hand in hand through the city, 2 people among millions, no longer the center of attention or the focus of gratitude or anything except a father and daughter getting ice cream on a Saturday evening. This was what Caleb needed, this anonymity, this normalcy, this return to a life where his biggest responsibility was choosing between chocolate and vanilla. The ice cream shop was busy with the weekend crowd, families and couples and groups of friends all treating themselves to something sweet. Caleb got coffee for himself, strawberry for Maisie, and they sat at a small table by the window watching people pass by outside. Did you like the party? Maisie asked, attacking her ice cream with single-minded focus. It was nice. A lot of people wanted to say thank you. For saving them. For landing the plane safely, yes. Are you going to fly planes again? The question caught him off guard, maybe because it echoed his own thoughts too closely. I don't know, maybe. Would that bother you? Maisie thought about it seriously, her face scrunched in concentration. Mom's in heaven, right? The sudden shift in topic made Caleb's throat tight. Yes, baby. And she can see us from there. I think so. I hope so. Then she saw you save all those people. And I think... Maisie paused, searching for the right words with the particular care that children brought to important thoughts. I think she'd be proud. Not because you flew the plane, but because you helped people who needed help. That's what good people do. Caleb had to look away, blinking back tears that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Out of the mouths of babes, the saying went, and here was his 7-year-old daughter offering wisdom he'd been too stubborn or scared to see himself. You're right, he managed finally. She would be proud. And you know what? I'm proud of you too, for being brave on the plane, for being patient today, for being such a smart, kind person, even when life has been hard. I learned from you, Daddy. And that, Caleb thought, was worth more than $63,000 or any amount of public gratitude. Knowing that he'd managed to raise someone good, someone compassionate, someone who understood that helping people mattered more than any other measure of success. They finished their ice cream in comfortable silence, just being together in a way that didn't require words. Then they walked home through streets growing dark, past buildings lit up against the night sky, through a city that kept living and breathing and moving forward regardless of individual drama or crisis. Home felt different when they got back. The same apartment, the same furniture, the same life waiting for them. But something had shifted in how Caleb saw it. Not as a retreat from the world, but as a foundation from which he could engage with it. Not as the limit of his ambitions, but as the secure base that made everything else possible. He got Maisie ready for bed, went through their ritual of story time and teeth brushing and checking for monsters under the bed. Then he sat in the kitchen with his laptop, staring at Reynolds' contact information, thinking about consulting work and civilian oversight and ways to stay connected to aviation without abandoning the life he'd built. The decision didn't have to be made tonight, but for the first time in 12 years, Caleb was letting himself consider possibilities beyond just survival, beyond just being present for Maisie, toward actually building something meaningful with his skills and experience. Maybe that's what Sarah would have wanted. Not for him to put his life on hold indefinitely, but to find ways to honor both his capabilities and his responsibilities, to be fully himself instead of just a fraction, even if that self was complicated and contradictory and sometimes terrifying. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Saw the coverage of the gathering. Sounds like it went well. Proud of you, mate. Let me know if you need to talk. And seriously consider what I said about being happy. Maisie needs a happy father, not just a present one. Caleb smiled despite himself. Marcus had always been good at cutting through his self-deception, at seeing the truth Caleb tried to hide even from himself. And he was right. Being present wasn't enough if you were miserable while doing it. Children were perceptive. Maisie would know if he was sacrificing his own happiness for hers, and that would teach her the wrong lessons about what love required. He opened his email and started typing a message to Reynolds. Commander, I'm interested in learning more about the consulting position. Can we set up a call this week to discuss details? I have some questions about schedule flexibility and time commitment, but I'm definitely interested. Caleb Mercer. He sent it before he could second-guess himself, before the familiar anxiety about change could make him retreat back into comfortable stagnation. Then he closed his laptop and sat in the quiet apartment listening to the sound of Maisie's peaceful breathing from her bedroom, feeling the weight of possibilities settling over him like a blanket. Change was terrifying, but so was staying frozen in place while life passed you by. And if he'd learned anything from São Miguel, it was that he was capable of handling terrifying things when he had to. Maybe it was time to handle them when he wanted to as well. Outside, Chicago settled into its nighttime rhythms, trains running, cars passing, people living their lives in millions of small moments that added up to something bigger. And in a modest apartment on the north side, a father sat thinking about futures and possibilities and the slow, difficult work of becoming whole again after breaking. The gathering had been about gratitude, But for Caleb, it had become something else, a mirror forcing him to see himself as others saw him, not as a failure or a dropout, or someone who'd given up on being exceptional, but as someone capable and strong and worth celebrating. He'd spent 12 years defining himself by what he'd lost. Maybe it was time to start defining himself by what he'd gained: a daughter who loved him, skills that could save lives, and the hard-won knowledge that you didn't have to choose between being a good father and being a complete person. You could be both. It was harder, required more juggling and compromise and careful balance. But it was possible. And possible, Caleb was starting to believe, was enough. Reynolds called back within an hour of receiving Caleb's email, his voice carrying the energy of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this response. "Mercer, glad to hear from you. I was hoping you'd take me up on this. How's Tuesday work for a detailed conversation? I can walk you through what the position entails, answer your questions, make sure it's actually a good fit before anyone commits to anything." They set up the call for Tuesday afternoon, after Caleb dropped Maisie at school but before he needed to pick her up. It gave him 2 days to think about what questions he wanted to ask, what concerns needed addressing, what it would actually mean to step back into aviation in any capacity after 12 years of deliberate distance. Those 2 days passed in a strange mixture of routine and anticipation. Caleb worked on his coding projects, took Maisie to her soccer practice, made dinners and checked homework, and maintained all the small rituals that defined their life together. But underneath the normalcy was a current of possibility he hadn't felt in years, the sense that maybe the future could be different than the past, without betraying anything he'd built. On Monday evening, after Maisie was in bed, Caleb found himself pulling out boxes from the back of his closet, the ones he'd packed away 4 years ago and hadn't opened since. Inside were pieces of his former life, flight suits with his name and rank embroidered on them, photos from carrier deployments, commendations, and certificates that documented a career he'd walked away from. At the bottom of one box was his old flight helmet, worn and scuffed from use, still carrying the faint smell of jet fuel and adrenaline. He sat on the bedroom floor holding that helmet, running his fingers over the familiar contours, remembering what it had felt like to be Lieutenant Commander Mercer instead of just Caleb, the freelance coder and single dad. He'd been good at flying, better than good, actually. His evaluations had consistently rated him exceptional. He'd been on track for command positions, for a career that could have taken him to the highest levels of naval aviation. Then Sarah died, and none of that mattered anymore compared to making sure Maisie had at least one parent who was present and stable and there for every bedtime story and scraped knee and school play. But Maisie was older now. She was in school full days, had friends and activities, and a life that didn't require his constant presence every single moment. Maybe there was room now for him to be more than just her father. Maybe there was space for him to be fully himself. The parts that flew and the parts that parented, integrated instead of separated. He put the helmet back in the box, but left the box out, visible, a reminder that his past didn't have to stay buried to protect his present. Tuesday's call with Reynolds lasted almost 2 hours. The position was exactly what Reynolds had described: consulting work for a civilian program that provided oversight and recommendations for military aviation training protocols. They needed people who understood both military culture and modern commercial aviation practices, who could bridge the gap between different flying philosophies and help update training to reflect real-world conditions. The time commitment is flexible, Reynolds explained. Most of the work can be done remotely, reviewing training materials, participating in virtual meetings, providing written assessments. Maybe once a quarter you'd need to travel for in-person evaluations, but even that could be scheduled around your daughter's school calendar. We're talking maybe 15 to 20 hours a week, and you control when those hours happen. And the compensation? Reynolds named a figure that made Caleb's breath catch. It wasn't fortune-level money, but it was substantially more than he made from freelance coding, and with better benefits and more stability. Combined with Maisie's now-funded college account, it would mean financial security he'd never quite achieved as a single parent scraping by on project work. There's one other component, Reynolds continued. Part of the oversight involves occasional flight evaluations. You'd need to maintain currency on relevant aircraft types, which means simulator time and potentially some actual flight hours. The program would cover all training and certification costs, but you'd need to commit to staying current. Is that something you'd be willing to do? Caleb thought about the last time he'd touched controls. That desperate landing on São Miguel, the feel of an aircraft fighting him every inch, the terror and focus and absolute clarity that came from being fully present in a moment that demanded everything. He thought about how alive he'd felt despite the fear, how right it had seemed to be back in a cockpit, even under the worst possible circumstances. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I'd be willing to do that. Good. Then let's talk about next steps. I'll send you the formal application materials, but honestly, that's just paperwork. As far as I'm concerned, you're exactly who we need for this position. You've got the technical expertise, the real-world experience, and the judgment that comes from making life or death decisions under pressure. Plus, São Miguel proved you can still fly when it matters. After the call ended, Caleb sat staring at his laptop screen, trying to process what he'd just agreed to. A return to aviation, structured and part-time, and built around his life with Maisie instead of competing with it. A way to use his skills for something meaningful beyond just paying bills. A path forward that didn't require abandoning either part of who he was. It felt right in a way that was both exciting and terrifying. That evening, while they were eating dinner, spaghetti tonight, Maisie's favorite, he brought it up as casually as he could manage. Hey baby, I wanted to talk to you about something. You know how I used to fly planes before you were born? Maisie nodded, twirling pasta around her fork with intense concentration. Well, someone offered me a job helping teach other pilots how to fly better. It would mean I'd need to practice flying sometimes, but mostly I'd work from home just like I do now. What do you think about that? She considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. Would you be gone a lot? No more than I am now. Maybe less, actually, because I could control my own schedule better. I'd still pick you up from school every day, still make dinner, still help with homework. It would just mean that sometimes I might be studying flight manuals instead of coding. Would you be happier? The question cut straight to the heart of what Caleb had been avoiding thinking about. Would he be happier? Or was he so used to defining happiness as just surviving and keeping Maisie safe that he'd forgotten how to want anything more? I think I might be, he admitted. I think I've been trying so hard to be a good dad that I forgot I could be other things too. And maybe being those other things would actually make me a better dad, because I wouldn't be sacrificing parts of myself to do it. Maisie set down her fork and looked at him with those enormous eyes that saw too much. Mom would want you to be happy, Daddy. She told me that. Caleb's throat went tight. When did she tell you that? I don't remember exactly. I was little, but she said that the people we love should make us happy, not sad, and that if she ever couldn't be here, she wanted you to keep being happy anyway. She couldn't have been more than 3 when Sarah died, barely old enough to retain coherent memories. But children remembered the strangest things, fragments of conversation, emotional impressions, the feeling of being loved even when the specifics faded. If she said Sarah had told her this, then probably some version of that conversation had happened, preserved in the imperfect archive of early childhood memory. Okay then, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to control. I'll take the job. But you have to promise me something. What? If it ever feels like I'm not around enough, if you ever feel like I'm choosing flying over you, you tell me immediately. Deal? Deal. She stuck out her hand for a formal handshake, and Caleb took it, sealing the agreement with the solemnity it deserved. The next few weeks blurred together in a rush of paperwork and preparation. Caleb filled out the formal application, went through background checks and security clearances, coordinated with the program administrators about start dates and training schedules. He arranged for simulator time at a facility near O'Hare, booking sessions during school hours so he could maintain his currency without impacting time with Maisie. The first time he climbed into a simulator cockpit, a 777 coincidentally, the same aircraft he'd landed on São Miguel, his hands shook as they reached for the controls. But once the simulation started, once the instruments lit up and the simulated engine spooled to life, something settled inside him. This was familiar territory. This was where he belonged. The training instructor, a gruff former Air Force pilot named Davidson, watched him run through emergency procedures with increasing interest. You're rusty on some of the commercial protocols, but your fundamentals are solid, better than solid, actually. Where'd you say you flew before? Navy, F-18s, carrier operations. Davidson whistled low. That explains it. You've got that carrier pilot precision. No wasted movement. Everything by the numbers. How long you been out? 12 years? 12 years and you fly like you never left. That's not common, Mercer. Most people who step away from aviation lose their edge. You just buried yours and pulled it back out when you needed it. They ran through scenario after scenario. Engine failures, hydraulic problems, electrical issues, every emergency that could happen at altitude. Caleb handled each one methodically, working through his mental checklists, making decisions based on priorities and probabilities rather than panic. It felt good to be tested like this, to prove to himself that São Miguel hadn't been a fluke but rather a demonstration of skills that were still sharp despite the years away. After the session, Davidson pulled him aside. I heard about what happened over the Atlantic. Read the NTSB preliminary report. That was some flying, especially considering how long you'd been out of practice. I got lucky. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You were prepared, even if you didn't think you were. That landing you pulled off, most commercial pilots couldn't have done it, and plenty of them fly every day. You've got a gift, Mercer. Don't waste it. Caleb started the consulting work in early November, just as Chicago was settling into the gray certainty of winter. The work was engaging in ways he hadn't expected, reviewing training protocols and identifying gaps, participating in discussions about how to better prepare pilots for real-world emergencies, contributing to curriculum development that would shape the next generation of military aviators. He was good at it too, bringing both technical expertise and the particular perspective that came from having actually experienced the kind of crisis most pilots only trained for. His first paycheck arrived in mid-November, and the amount still made him slightly dizzy. After 12 years of scraping by, of choosing between new shoes for Maisie and getting his own car repaired, of constantly juggling which bills could wait and which couldn't, financial stability felt surreal. He opened a savings account for the first time in his adult life, paid off the credit card debt he'd been carrying since Sarah's funeral, bought Maisie a new winter coat without having to check his bank balance first. The changes were subtle but meaningful. Fewer sleepless nights worrying about money, less stress radiating through everything he did, more mental space for actually living instead of just surviving. Maisie noticed too, commenting that he seemed happier, more relaxed, more like the daddy she remembered from before everything got hard. In December, the consulting program asked him to travel to San Diego for an in-person evaluation of a new training simulation. It would mean 3 days away, the longest he'd been separated from Maisie since Sarah died. The idea made his chest tight with anxiety he thought he'd moved past. I can ask someone else to go, he told Reynolds during their weekly check-in call, someone without a daughter who needs them home. Or you could go and let your daughter learn that it's okay for parents to have responsibilities beyond their children. Mercer, you're not abandoning her by taking a business trip. You're showing her that adults have complex lives and that's normal and healthy. Caleb talked to Maisie about it that evening, expecting resistance or fear or some sign that this was too much too fast. Instead, she said, "Will you bring me back a souvenir?" "That's it? Just a souvenir? And you have to call me every night before bed. And video chat so I can show you if Mr. Buttons learned any new tricks." "Mr. Buttons is a stuffed bear, baby. He doesn't learn tricks." "He might while you're gone. You don't know." They arranged for Maisie to stay with Marcus and Emma, who'd recently moved to Chicago and were delighted to have her. Emma had been asking about babysitting opportunities, saying she needed practice before they started trying for their own kids, and Maisie adored her with the particular intensity that children reserved for cool adults who treated them like equals. The trip to San Diego was professionally successful and personally revelatory. Caleb spent 3 days immersed in aviation culture, surrounded by people who spoke his language and understood his references and valued his expertise. He participated in simulations, reviewed new training protocols, contributed to discussions about how to better prepare pilots for the kind of hydraulic failure he'd experienced over the Atlantic. His recommendations were taken seriously, integrated into curriculum plans, treated as valuable insights rather than just opinions. He was good at this, really good. And being good at something beyond parenting felt like rediscovering a part of himself he'd thought was permanently lost. But every evening, he video called Maisie and listened to her chatter about her day with Marcus and Emma, about the pancakes they'd made for breakfast and the movie they'd watched, and yes, Mr. Buttons had learned to do a somersault, Daddy. Look, see? And Caleb would smile and ask questions and feel his heart pull in two directions at once, toward the work that engaged his mind and toward the child who held his heart. Maybe this was what balance actually felt like. Not choosing one thing over another, but holding multiple truths at once. He was a father and a consultant, a caregiver and a professional, someone capable of both nurturing his daughter and contributing meaningfully to the world beyond their small family unit. He brought Maisie a stuffed seal from the San Diego airport, ridiculous and overpriced, but she loved it immediately, naming it Captain Whiskers and assigning it a place of honor next to Mr. Buttons. The fact that she'd been fine without him, had even enjoyed her time with Marcus and Emma, was both reassuring and slightly devastating. She didn't need him every single second. She was growing up, becoming independent, learning that love didn't require constant physical presence. Christmas that year felt different than the ones since Sarah died. They got a real tree instead of the small artificial one Caleb usually put up because the real ones were expensive and messy and generally more trouble than he could manage. They decorated it together, Maisie chattering about school and friends, and Captain Whisker's opinions on ornament placement while Christmas music played in the background. Caleb had invited Marcus and Emma to join them for Christmas dinner, not wanting to spend another holiday in the quiet grief of just two people missing a third. Emma brought homemade pie, and Marcus brought terrible jokes, and together they filled the apartment with noise and laughter and the particular warmth that came from chosen family. After Maisie went to bed, full of cookies and excitement about Santa's impending visit, the three adults sat in the living room with wine and the companionable silence of people comfortable enough not to need constant conversation. "You seem different," Emma observed, studying Caleb with the directness that had made him nervous when they first met, but that he'd come to appreciate. "Lighter, somehow." "The consulting work is good, really good. I didn't realize how much I'd missed it. Not flying specifically, but using that part of my brain, being around people who understand aviation, contributing to something bigger than just my individual survival." "Sarah would be proud of you," Marcus said quietly. "For saving those people, yes, but more for figuring out how to live again instead of just existing." Caleb had to look away, blinking against tears that came too easily lately. "I think she'd be frustrated it took me so long. She was never patient with self-pity." "No, she wasn't," Marcus agreed, smiling at the memory. "She'd have kicked your ass years ago if she'd seen you martyring yourself like that." They talked into the night about Sarah, sharing memories that had grown softer with time, the sharp edges of grief worn down by years until what remained was mostly love and gratitude for the time they'd had, rather than rage about what had been stolen. Caleb realized he could think about her now without it feeling like someone was standing on his chest, could remember the good parts without being destroyed by the awareness that there would never be more good parts. Maybe that was healing, not forgetting or moving on, but integrating loss into the larger story of a life until it was just one chapter instead of the defining narrative. New Year's Eve found them back at the apartment with just Caleb and Maisie, watching the ball drop on television even though Maisie was fighting sleep and losing badly. At 11:47, she finally gave up the battle and curled against his side, breathing evening out into the gentle rhythm of childhood sleep. Caleb held her and thought about the year that was ending. 12 months ago, he'd been in roughly the same position, same couch, same apartment, same daughter sleeping against his shoulder. But everything else had changed. He'd landed a crippled aircraft, faced down his own limitations and discovered they were more flexible than he'd believed, accepted gratitude from strangers who'd become part of his story, and finally, allowed himself to want something beyond just survival. The year ahead was full of uncertainty. The consulting work might not last. The balance he'd found might prove unsustainable. Any number of things could go wrong because life was fundamentally uncertain and pretending otherwise was just comfortable delusion. But for now, in this moment, Caleb was content. More than content, he was actually happy in a way he hadn't been since before Sarah died. Happy with his work, happy with his daughter, happy with the life he'd built from wreckage and determination and the stubborn refusal to let grief be the final word. The ball dropped, the year changed, and outside fireworks exploded in distant celebration. Maisie slept through all of it, secure in the knowledge that her father was there and would always be there when she needed him. And Caleb sat holding his daughter, listening to the city celebrate, and felt at peace with all the versions of himself he'd been and was becoming. The pilot and the father. The hero and the ordinary man. The person who'd saved hundreds of lives and the person whose greatest accomplishment was making sure one small girl knew she was loved. 3 months later, on a bright March afternoon, Caleb stood on a rooftop in Chicago with Maisie beside him. They came up here sometimes now, when the weather allowed, just to be outside and above the city, to feel the wind and see the sky stretching endlessly in all directions. Maisie was telling him about a project at school, something involving volcanoes and baking soda that had apparently gone spectacularly wrong, but in the fun way rather than the disaster way. Caleb listened with half his attention, the other half absorbed in watching an aircraft on final approach to O'Hare, tracking its descent, mentally running through the landing checklist out of habit. "Daddy?" Maisie's voice pulled him back. "Are you listening?" "Sorry, baby. I was watching that plane land." "Do you miss it, being a pilot?" "Sometimes, but I'm not a pilot anymore. I just pilot differently now, helping other people get better at it instead of doing it myself all the time." "But you still fly sometimes, in the simulators." "True. And I'm actually getting certified for some real flight time soon. The program wants me to maintain currency on multiple aircraft types, which means actual hours, not just simulation." Maisie considered this, then asked the question that had probably been building for months. "Would you go back? To the military, I mean, if they asked you?" Caleb crouched down to her level, taking her hands in his. "No, baby. That part of my life is over, and I'm okay with that. I found something better, a way to use my skills while still being here for you. I wouldn't trade that for anything." "Not even to be a hero again?" "Maisie, look at me. I was never a hero. I was just a guy in the right place at the right time who happened to know what to do. But you know what takes more courage than landing one plane in an emergency? Showing up every single day to take care of someone you love. Making breakfast and checking homework and going to parent-teacher conferences. That's the real heroism, the quiet, daily kind that nobody celebrates but that makes all the difference." "So you're a hero for being my dad?" "No, I'm just your dad. But being your dad is the most important thing I'll ever be, even if I live to be 100 and do 1,000 other impressive things. Nothing will ever matter more than this, you and me, together, building a life that honors your mom's memory while still moving forward." Maisie hugged him tight, and they stood like that for a long moment, father and daughter on a rooftop above a city that had witnessed both their worst night and their slow recovery from it. Finally, she pulled back and looked at him seriously. "Daddy, if Mom could see us now, do you think she'd be proud?" Caleb thought about Sarah, vibrant and funny, and absolutely intolerant of self-pity or wasted potential. Thought about what she'd say if she could see him now, rebuilding his life instead of just enduring it, using his skills while still prioritizing their daughter, finding ways to be whole instead of broken. "Yeah, baby, I think she'd be proud, not because I landed that plane or took the consulting job or any of the big dramatic things. I think she'd be proud because we didn't let losing her destroy us. We kept going, kept building, kept finding reasons to be happy even when being happy felt impossible. That takes more courage than anything else I've ever done." "I'm proud of you too, Daddy." The simple statement hit him harder than any amount of public gratitude or professional recognition ever could. This was what mattered, his daughter's approval, her happiness, her certainty that he'd been there when she needed him and would continue to be there no matter what else changed. "Thank you, baby. That means everything to me." They stayed on the rooftop until the sun started setting, painting the sky in colors that shifted too fast to name, watching the city transform from day to night the way it had done for centuries and would continue doing long after they were gone. The world was so much larger than their individual stories, and yet those stories mattered to them, mattered to the people whose lives intersected with theirs, created ripples that spread further than anyone could track. On a red-eye flight to London months ago, Caleb had thought his only job was to keep one promise to one little girl. But in keeping that promise, he'd kept hundreds of others, to passengers he'd never met, to families who would have been shattered by loss, to a future that got to exist because he'd refused to accept that death was inevitable. And now, standing on this rooftop with his daughter, he understood that the story wasn't about one dramatic moment of heroism. It was about all the moments before and after, the decision to help an elderly woman with her luggage, the choice to walk forward when it would have been easier to stay seated, the daily work of being present for Maisie even when being present meant confronting his own grief and inadequacy. Heroes in the stories were special people who did extraordinary things. Heroes in real life were ordinary people who kept showing up, kept trying, kept choosing to help, even when help was hard or scary or came with costs they couldn't fully calculate. Caleb had never wanted to be a hero. He just wanted to be a good father, a decent person, someone who could look his daughter in the eye and know he'd done his best with what he'd been given. But maybe that was the same thing. Maybe the quiet heroism of daily life, making breakfast and packing lunches and showing up for school plays, was exactly as important as the dramatic heroism of emergency landings. Maybe both kinds mattered, and maybe the person who could do both was just someone who'd learned to integrate all the pieces of themselves instead of choosing between them. "Ready to go home?" Caleb asked as the last light faded from the sky. "Yeah, can we have pizza for dinner?" "Sure, baby, whatever you want." They rode the elevator down, walked through streets now fully dark, headed toward the small apartment that contained their life and their history and all the futures they were still building. Just a father and daughter going home for pizza. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth celebrating. Except it was worth celebrating. It was worth everything. Because this was what he'd fought for in that cockpit over the Atlantic. Not his own survival, but the survival of this routine. These ordinary moments, the simple happiness of being together and choosing what to have for dinner. The passengers he'd saved had gone back to their own versions of this, their own families, their own routines, their own ordinary extraordinariness. Some had sent him Christmas cards. Others had stayed in touch through occasional emails, updating him on engagements and graduations and grandchildren born. Each message was a reminder that his choices had consequences that rippled outward in ways he'd never fully see. But the consequence that mattered most was right here beside him, holding his hand, chattering about pizza toppings and whether Captain Whiskers preferred mushrooms or pepperoni. At the apartment while they waited for delivery, Maisie settled at the kitchen table with her homework, and Caleb checked his email. There was a message from Reynolds with details about next quarter's travel schedule, another from the program director praising his latest training assessment, a note from Patricia Santos at United Airlines asking if he'd be willing to speak at their annual safety conference. He'd say yes to the safety conference, he decided. Not because he wanted the attention or the platform, but because if his experience could help even one pilot handle an emergency better, could save even one life, then it was worth the discomfort of being public about something so personal. That was the choice he kept making now. Not comfort over impact, but impact even when it cost him comfort. It was how he honored both Sarah's memory and the 280 lives that had been placed in his hands. By continuing to show up, continuing to contribute, continuing to be fully himself instead of hiding behind the safe boundaries of single parenthood. The pizza arrived, and they ate at the coffee table like they always did, watching nature documentaries and arguing amiably about whether penguins or seals were better swimmers. Normal life, routine moments, the stuff that didn't make headlines but that comprised the actual substance of living. This was enough. This was everything. Later, after Maisie was in bed and the apartment was quiet, Caleb stood at the window looking out at Chicago's nighttime landscape. Somewhere out there, aircraft were taking off and landing, pilots running through their checklists, passengers trusting that they'd arrive safely at their destinations. Most of the time, that trust was warranted. Most of the time, nothing went wrong. But when things did go wrong, people like Caleb were ready. Not because they were special or extraordinary, but because they'd been trained and had stayed ready even when readiness seemed pointless, even when the skills seemed irrelevant to their current lives. He'd spent 12 years thinking he'd left aviation behind. But you never really left your calling, you just found new ways to answer it. For him, that meant consulting work and simulator training and occasional speeches about emergency preparedness. Small contributions, maybe, but meaningful ones that used his experience to make the world incrementally safer. And at the end of each day, he came home to Maisie, checked her homework, tucked her in, promised her that tomorrow would come, and he'd be there to see it with her. That was the real work, the foundation that made everything else possible. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Emma's pregnant. Thought you should be one of the first to know. You're going to be Uncle Caleb. Feel free to panic. Caleb smiled, typing back his congratulations, feeling genuinely happy for his friends as they stepped into the chaos and joy of parenthood. They'd be good at it, he thought. They had each other, had their love and commitment, had the kind of partnership that made hard things manageable. He'd done it alone, and that had been harder than anything he'd ever experienced, including carrier landings and emergency descents. But he'd done it, and Maisie was turning out better than he could have hoped, kind and smart and brave in the ways that actually mattered. Maybe that was his real legacy, not the dramatic landing that had made news around the world, but the quiet work of raising a good human being, a person who helped others, who thought about consequences, who understood that real heroism was showing up even when it was hard. The city lights blurred slightly, and Caleb realized he was crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude of having survived long enough to see this moment, to be here, in this life, with this daughter, doing work that mattered while still being present for the small daily miracles that comprised actual living. Sarah would have loved this, would have been proud of him for finally figuring out how to live instead of just survive, would have adored watching Maisie grow into someone so thoroughly herself, so confident and capable and good. I kept my promise, Caleb whispered to the empty room, to Sarah's memory, to the universe that had taken her too soon but had given him the strength to carry on without her. I came back, and I'm still here, and we're going to be okay. Outside, aircraft lights blinked against the dark sky. Arrivals and departures, journeys beginning and ending, people moving through space toward the futures they were building. Each light represented lives, families, stories, playing out in parallel to his own, all of them connected by the shared experience of being human and vulnerable and somehow still hoping for good outcomes despite knowing how easily things could go wrong. Caleb watched until the sky was quiet, until the last visible aircraft had disappeared into the distance, until there was nothing left but stars and city lights and the peaceful certainty that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to show up for the people who needed him. Then he turned away from the window, checked on Maisie one final time. She was sleeping peacefully, Mr. Buttons and Captain Whiskers arranged protectively on either side, and climbed into his own bed. Sleep came easily now, untroubled by the nightmares that had plagued him in the weeks after São Miguel. His dreams when they came were ordinary, flying through clear skies, walking with Maisie through parks he'd never visited, conversations with Sarah that left him feeling peaceful rather than devastated. And when morning came, as it always did, he woke to the sound of his daughter's voice calling him from her room, asking if they could have waffles for breakfast, reminding him about her field trip permission slip that needed signing, pulling him into another day of the beautiful, ordinary work of being exactly who he was meant to be. A father, a consultant, a pilot, a person who'd learned that you didn't have to choose between different versions of yourself. You just had to find ways to honor all of them while keeping your promises to the people who mattered most. And as Caleb made waffles and signed permission slips and prepared to walk Maisie to school on another ordinary Tuesday morning, he understood with perfect clarity that this was the real happy ending. Not dramatic or headline-worthy, not the kind of story that would inspire movies or books. Just a man who'd survived impossible things, found his way back to living, and chose every single day to keep showing up for the quiet heroism of being present. That was enough. That was everything. That was home.